The senile old woman my son and his wife abandoned at a gas station in the middle of nowhere had just transferred every penny of their $847,000 savings to charity. And Michael was about to discover that the mother he'd dismissed as technologically hopeless had actually spent 40 years as one of the most respected banking security specialists in the state of Colorado. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if this story hits home for you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's part will reveal exactly how a 70-year-old grandmother gained access to accounts her own son thought were unhackable. My name is Margaret Elizabeth Chen, and at 70 years old, I thought I understood my place in my family's life. I lived in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house in Boulder, Colorado, a home I'd bought 30 years ago when I was still working full-time and raising my son Michael as a single mother. The house had a small but well-maintained garden, a cozy kitchen where I loved to bake cookies for my grandchildren, and a home office that most people assumed I used for paying bills and playing solitaire on an old computer. What my family didn't know was that the computer setup in my home office was worth more than most people's cars, equipped with security protocols and software access that could make or break financial institutions across the state. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Michael was my only child, born when I was 35 years old, after years of fertility struggles with my late husband David. David died when Michael was 12, leaving me to navigate single parenthood while building a career in the emerging field of computer banking security. It wasn't easy being one of the few women in technology in the 1980s and 90s, but I was determined to provide Michael with every opportunity I'd never had. I worked for First National Bank of Colorado for 38 years, starting as a teller, and eventually becoming their Senior Vice President of Electronic Security Systems. I helped design the fraud prevention protocols that protected over 2 million customer accounts, trained FBI agents on cybercrime detection, and testified in federal court cases involving banking fraud. By the time I retired at 65, I was making $185,000 a year and had accumulated a pension that would support me comfortably for the rest of my life. But Michael never really understood what I did for work. When he was growing up, I'd tell him I worked with computers at the bank, and he'd nod politely before going back to his homework or video games. As he got older and became more focused on his own career in financial planning, he seemed to assume that my job had been some kind of clerical position, filing paperwork or entering data, the kind of work that didn't require any special skills or knowledge. After I retired 5 years ago, Michael's perception of my technological abilities seemed to solidify around the idea that I was a typical elderly woman who needed help setting up her email and couldn't figure out how to use streaming services. He'd visit my house and see me struggling to remember how to cast Netflix to my TV, or asking him to help me update my phone, and he'd smile indulgently while explaining things in the slow, patient voice people use with children or people they assume aren't very bright. What he didn't realize was that I was perfectly capable of managing advanced cybersecurity protocols for multi-billion-dollar financial institutions, but genuinely confused by the unnecessarily complicated interfaces that consumer technology companies seem to design specifically to frustrate anyone over the age of 50. There's a big difference between not understanding technology and not understanding poorly designed user interfaces, but Michael had never bothered to learn the difference. 3 years ago, Michael married Rebecca Walsh, a 28-year-old, former pharmaceutical sales representative who had transitioned into being what she called a lifestyle influencer after their wedding. Rebecca was undeniably beautiful, tall, blonde, with the kind of polished appearance that looked effortless, but probably required hours of daily maintenance. She had a bright smile, a bubbly personality, and an Instagram account with over 50,000 followers who seemed fascinated by her posts about luxury skincare routines, expensive workout clothes, and designer home decor. Michael was absolutely smitten with Rebecca from the moment they met at a charity fundraiser where he was managing investments for several of the major donors. He'd always been attracted to women who were more social and outgoing than he was, and Rebecca's confidence and social media savvy seemed to represent everything he wished he could be, but was too introverted to achieve on his own. When they announced their engagement after dating for only 8 months, I was cautiously supportive. Rebecca seemed to make Michael happy, and she was always perfectly polite to me during family gatherings. She called me Margaret instead of any variation of Mom, which felt a bit formal, but wasn't necessarily problematic. She complimented my cooking, asked thoughtful questions about my retirement activities, and seemed genuinely interested in building a relationship with me. The first red flag came when they were house hunting. Michael and Rebecca had been living in his downtown Denver condo, but Rebecca wanted something larger and more suburban. Somewhere we can really build a life and start a family, as she put it. They found a beautiful 5-bedroom house in Highlands Ranch, one of Denver's most exclusive suburbs, with a price tag of $750,000. Michael's financial advisor's salary was good, but not $750,000 house good, especially with Rebecca not working a traditional job. When Michael mentioned that they were struggling to come up with the down payment, I offered to help. "Sweetheart, I'd be happy to contribute to your down payment," I told him during one of our weekly dinners. "I want you and Rebecca to have the home you're dreaming of." "Mom, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't ask you to do that," Michael had replied, though I could see the relief in his eyes. "You're not asking, I'm offering. I have savings that I'll never need, and I'd rather see them help you build your life than sit in investment accounts that I'll never touch." "How much were you thinking?" Rebecca had asked, leaning forward with sudden interest. "Well, a 20% down payment would be $150,000. I could probably manage that, though it would be most of my liquid savings." "Actually," Rebecca had said, her smile becoming even brighter, "if you could do $200,000, we could put down 25% and get a much better interest rate. That would save us hundreds of dollars every month." I agreed to the $200,000, withdrawing nearly all of my readily available savings to help them secure their dream home. Michael was grateful, Rebecca was thrilled, and I felt good about being able to provide such meaningful support to my only child as he started this new chapter of his life. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly that gesture of generosity would be reframed as something I owed them rather than something I had chosen to give them. Within 6 months of moving into their new house, Rebecca had quit her lifestyle influencer work to focus on creating the perfect home environment and preparing for motherhood. Michael's income was stretched thin by their mortgage, property taxes, and Rebecca's expensive tastes in furniture and decor. But they seemed happy and committed to building their life together. Emma was born 11 months after their wedding, a beautiful little girl with Michael's dark hair and Rebecca's bright blue eyes. I was overjoyed to become a grandmother and immediately offered to help with childcare whenever they needed it. "Margaret, that would be so wonderful," Rebecca had said during one of my visits to meet the baby. "I'm so overwhelmed with everything, and Michael's work schedule is so demanding. Having your support would mean everything to us." At first, my babysitting was genuinely helpful and appreciated. I'd come over once or twice a week for a few hours, giving Rebecca time to run errands or take a nap while I bonded with my granddaughter. Michael would come home from work to find dinner prepared, the baby content, and Rebecca relaxed and happy. Everyone seemed to benefit from the arrangement, but gradually my voluntary help became expected help, and expected help became demanded help. By the time Jake was born 3 years later, I was providing childcare 3 or 4 days a week, often for 8 to 10 hours at a time. What had started as, "Could you watch Emma for a couple of hours while I go to the grocery store?" had evolved into, "We need you here at 7 a.m. and we'll be back around 6 p.m. with no discussion of whether I had other plans or commitments." Not that I minded spending time with Emma and Jake. They were wonderful children, bright, funny, affectionate kids who seemed to genuinely enjoy their time with me. Emma was 7 now, excelling in school and taking piano lessons that she was genuinely talented at. Jake was 4, full of energy and curiosity, the kind of little boy who turned every mundane activity into an adventure. But I was starting to feel less like a beloved grandmother who was invited to be part of their lives, and more like an on-call childcare service that was expected to be available whenever Michael and Rebecca's schedules required it. The requests were always framed as emergencies or special circumstances. Rebecca would call and say she had a crucial business meeting, though I was never quite clear what business she was in, or Michael would text that he had an unexpected client dinner that required both of them to be out until late. The childcare needs were always immediate, always urgent, and always presented as if I was the only possible solution to their problem. What bothered me most wasn't the frequency of the requests. I genuinely loved spending time with my grandchildren, but the way my availability was simply assumed rather than requested. Rebecca would text me on Sunday evening with a schedule for the upcoming week: Tuesday 8 to 6, Thursday 9 to 5, Friday 7 to 8. Not, "Would you be available to help us this week?" Or, "Could we ask for your assistance with the kids?" Just a schedule, delivered like I was an employee rather than a family member. And if I ever suggested that I might not be available or might need to adjust the timing, the response was always the same: emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for having any needs or preferences of my own. "Margaret, I don't know what we'll do if you can't help us," Rebecca would say, her voice taking on a stressed, almost panicked tone. "Michael's job is so demanding, and I'm barely keeping my head above water managing the house and the kids. Schedules. We're really counting on your support." Or Michael would call and say, "Mom, we're really in a bind here. I know it's last minute, but this client meeting could mean a huge commission, and we can't afford to miss the opportunity. Can you please help us out?" How could I say no to that? How could I prioritize my own convenience over my son's career, success, or my daughter-in-law's mental health? So I'd rearrange my plans, cancel my commitments, and show up at their house with a smile, ready to spend another day managing their children's needs while they handled their adult responsibilities. But the final straw, the incident that changed everything, began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in September. The call came at 6:47 a.m., jolting me awake from the deepest part of my sleep cycle. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, squinting at the bright screen in my dark bedroom. "Margaret, we need you here by 8 a.m., Rebecca's voice cut through my grogginess without any greeting or pleasantries. "Michael's big presentation got moved up to this morning, and I have that spa appointment I've been planning for 2 months. The kids need to be at school by 8:30. I sat up, in bed, trying to process what she was telling me. This was the first I'd heard of any childcare needs for today, and the demand for me to be there in just over an hour gave me no time to mentally prepare or plan my day. "Of course, Rebecca. I'll be right there," I heard myself saying, though part of my brain was noting that this was the third emergency childcare request in 2 weeks. "Great! The kids are already dressed and fed. Michael will be gone when you get there, and I'll leave right after you arrive. We'll be back by 6. She hung up before I could ask any questions or express any concerns about the short notice. Dragged myself out of bed, threw on the first clothes I could find, and made the 45-minute drive to Highlands Ranch in morning traffic that was heavier than usual due to an accident on I-25. By the time I arrived at their house, I was feeling frazzled and under-caffeinated, but I was there at 8 a.m. as Guy requested. Michael was in the kitchen, pacing around with his Bluetooth headset attached to his ear, gesticulating wildly as he talked about quarterly projections and market analytics. He was dressed in one of his most expensive suits, a navy blue Armani that Rebecca had bought him for their anniversary, and his hair was styled with more product than usual. This was clearly an important day for him professionally. "Mom, thanks for coming," he said during a brief pause in his phone conversation, barely making eye contact with me. "Everything's under control here. The kids know you're coming, and Rebecca left a list of instructions on the counter." He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen island, where I could see a handwritten note in Rebecca's careful script, before immediately returning to his phone call. Yes, I understand the timeline concerns, but our analysis shows that the market volatility creates opportunities for clients who are willing to take calculated risks. Rebecca appeared 15 minutes later, looking like she was preparing for a magazine photo shoot rather than a spa day. Her blonde hair was arranged in perfect beachy waves, her makeup was flawless despite the early hour, and she was wearing a set of matching athleisure wear that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. "Margaret, you're an absolute lifesaver," she said, grabbing a large Louis Vuitton tote bag from the counter. "Emma needs to practice piano for at least 30 minutes. Her recital is next week and she's still struggling with the Allegro section. Jake has preschool workbook pages that need to be finished before tomorrow. I left everything clearly marked on the instruction list." She paused at the kitchen island to grab her list and hand it to me. As I scanned the handwritten notes, I realized this wasn't just basic childcare. It was a detailed schedule of educational activities, household chores, and errands that would keep me busy for the entire day. "Also," Rebecca continued, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror, "could you throw in a load of laundry? The kids' school clothes are really piling up, and I haven't had time to stay on top of it. The detergent is in the laundry room upstairs." "Of course," I replied automatically, though I was mentally calculating how long each task would take and realizing that I was looking at a very full day. "Perfect. I'll see you tonight." The kids absolutely love spending time with their grandma. "Margaret." She blew me a quick air kiss and headed for the door, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume and the faint sound of her heels clicking on the marble foyer. Michael finished his phone call just as Rebecca was leaving. "Mom, I really appreciate you doing this. This presentation could be huge for us, potential new clients worth millions in assets under management." "I'm happy to help, sweetheart. Good luck with your presentation." "Thanks. I'll probably be late. Tonight. But Rebecca should be back by 6 to relieve you." And then he was gone too, leaving me alone in their pristine house with Emma and Jake, who were finishing their breakfast at the kitchen island. "Grandma Margaret!" Jake squealed, jumping down from his chair to give me a hug. "Are you staying with us today?" "I am, buddy. What do you want to do first?" "Can we build a fort?" Emma asked, her dark eyes lighting up with excitement. "Mom doesn't like us to use the living room furniture, but maybe we could use pillows in the playroom." Looking at my grandchildren's eager faces, I felt the familiar warmth that always came with spending time with them. Whatever frustrations I had with Michael and Rebecca's assumptions about my availability, I genuinely loved being with Emma and Jake. They were good kids, polite, creative, affectionate, and they seemed to enjoy our time together as much as I did. "We can definitely build a fort," I said, pulling Rebecca's instruction list from my pocket. "But first, let's take a look at what your mom wants us to accomplish today." The list was extensive and detailed. Emma's piano practice, 30 minutes. Minimum? Focus on recital pieces. Jake's workbook, pages 23-28, help with letter formation. Laundry, kids' clothes, upstairs hamper, fold and put away. Kitchen, load-run dishwasher, wipe down counters and appliances. Playroom, organize toys, vacuum rug Emma's. Room, make bed, tidy desk area, Jake's room. Make bed, sort through outgrown clothes. Grocery list, attached. Pick up after school pickup. School pickup, 3:15 p.m. Emma, 3:45 p.m. Jake, different locations. Dinner prep, chicken and vegetables, recipe attached. I stared at the list, realizing that Rebecca had essentially planned a full day of household management and childcare that would keep me busy from 8 a.m. until at least 6 p.m., when she planned to return from her spa day. "Wow," Emma said, reading over my shoulder. "That's a lot of stuff. Mom usually does that over like 3 days. Out of the mouths of babes. But I'm not one to complain or make children feel responsible for adult problems, so I folded the list and put it back in my pocket. "Well then, we'd better get started. Emma, why don't you practice piano first while Jake and I tackle his workbook pages? Then we can all work on the fun stuff together. The morning passed quickly. Emma dutifully practiced her piano pieces, stumbling through the challenging sections, but showing real improvement with some focused guidance. Jake worked on his letter formation with the concentrated intensity that 4-year-olds bring to tasks they find important. I managed to get a load of laundry started, and the dishwasher running between helping with their educational activities. Around 11 a.m., we built an elaborate pillow fort in the playroom, complete with secret passages and a royal throne made from Jake's little armchair. We read stories, played games, and I helped them with a craft project that involved way more glitter than any reasonable adult would have approved of. By lunchtime, I was feeling good about our day. The kids were happy and engaged. We'd accomplished most of the items on Rebecca's list, and I was genuinely enjoying our time together. This was the kind of grandmother experience I'd always imagined, being helpful and involved while creating positive memories with my grandchildren. That's when Michael called. "Mom, quick change of plans," he said without any preamble. "My presentation went incredibly well, and the clients want to extend our meeting into a working lunch. Rebecca's spa appointment is running long, too. Can you handle pickup and stay? With the kids until around 8 tonight?" "Of course, Michael. That's wonderful news about your presentation." "Thanks. I really think this could lead to some major new accounts. Oh, and Rebecca mentioned that there are groceries that need to be picked up. The list should be somewhere in the kitchen." "I found it. We'll take care of everything." "You're the best, Mom. I don't know what we'd do without you." After he hung up, I looked at Emma and Jake, who were covered in glitter and peanut butter from our morning activities. "Looks like I'm staying for dinner, guys. What do you think about a trip to the grocery store after lunch?" "Can we get ice cream?" Jake asked hopefully. "If it's on your mom's list," I replied, though I was already mentally adding ice cream to our cart regardless of what Rebecca had written down. The afternoon was more challenging than the morning had been. Emma and Jake were tired from their active morning, and the grocery store trip with 2 cranky children was exactly as difficult as anyone who's ever taken young kids shopping would expect. Jake had a meltdown in the cereal aisle because we couldn't find his favorite brand, and Emma got upset when I wouldn't let her buy a candy bar that wasn't on the approved snack list. By the time we got home, unloaded groceries, and started dinner preparation, I was feeling the full weight of my 70 years. The chicken and vegetable recipe that Rebecca had left required more prep work than I'd anticipated, and keeping 2 tired children entertained while cooking in someone else's kitchen was more stressful than I'd expected. But we managed. Dinner was on the table by 6 p.m., the kids were fed and reasonably content, and I was looking forward to Rebecca's return so I could head home and collapse on my own couch. At 6:15 p.m., my phone rang. It was Rebecca. "Margaret, I'm so sorry, but Michael and I decided to grab dinner together since we both had such successful days. We're going to make it a date night and catch up properly. Can you stay with the kids until around 11? I felt a flash of irritation that I tried to keep out of my voice. "Rebecca, I've been here for 10 hours. I'm pretty tired and I wasn't prepared for such a long day." "I know, and I feel terrible about asking, but we so rarely get time together without the kids, and Michael's work has been so stressful lately. This would really mean a lot to us. What about the children's bedtime routine? I don't know all the details of what they need. It's all posted on Emma's bedroom door. They're really good kids. They'll walk you through it if you need help." I looked at Emma and Jake, who were finishing their dinner and listening to our conversation with the careful attention that children pay to adult discussions that might affect them. "All right, Rebecca. I'll stay until you get home." "You're an angel, Margaret. Truly. We'll make it up to you, I promise." After she hung up, Emma looked at me with her serious 7-year-old expression. "Grandma Margaret, are you sad that Mom and Dad aren't coming home?" "Not sad, sweetheart. Just a little tired. But I love spending time with you and Jake, so it's okay. Mom and Dad go out a lot when you're here," Jake said matter-of-factly. More than when other babysitters come. That comment stuck with me as we worked through the bedtime routine. Other babysitters? How often were Michael and Rebecca going out when I thought I was providing emergency childcare? The bedtime routine posted on Emma's door was detailed and lengthy. Baths, teeth brushing, story time, specific prayers, and a complex system of nightlights and sound machines that had to be arranged just right. By the time both kids were asleep, it was nearly 9 p.m., and I was exhausted. I settled into the living room to wait for Michael and Rebecca's return, feeling every one of my 70 years in my tired bones. This had been a much longer and more demanding day than I'd expected, and I was looking forward to getting home to my own bed. At 10:30 p.m., Michael called again. "Mom, Rebecca's not feeling well. I think something she ate at the spa didn't agree with her. We're going to get a hotel room nearby and make sure she's okay before driving home. Can you stay overnight with the kids?" I was so tired that it took me a moment to process what he was asking. "Michael, I don't have any of my things with me. I don't have my medications, my pajamas, or anything I need for an overnight stay. There are extra toothbrushes in the guest bathroom, and you can borrow some of Rebecca's clothes if you need to. The kids will be fine, and it's just one night. Sweetheart, what kind of food poisoning requires a hotel stay? If Rebecca's really sick, shouldn't she be at home where she's comfortable? Mom, please don't question our judgment. We know what's best for our situation. We really need you to handle this." Something in his tone made me too tired to argue further. "All right, Michael. I'll stay with the kids." "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver. We'll definitely be back in the morning." I found some basic toiletries in the guest bathroom and borrowed a t-shirt from Rebecca's dresser to sleep in. The guest bed was comfortable, and I fell asleep quickly despite the unexpected change in plans. But before I went to sleep, something nagged at me enough to pick up my phone and do something I rarely did: check social media. I opened Instagram and searched for Rebecca's profile. What I found made my exhaustion instantly transform into anger. There was Rebecca, posting stories from what was clearly a luxury resort spa. She looked radiant and healthy, not at all like someone suffering from food poisoning. And there was Michael beside her, raising a champagne glass in a toast, looking like he was having the time of his life. The captions told the whole story: much needed couple time, and recharging our batteries, and so grateful for this spontaneous getaway. They weren't dealing with Rebecca's illness. They were on an impromptu romantic vacation, using me as their free live-in nanny while they enjoyed themselves at what looked like a 5-star resort. I screenshot every single post, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Something told me I might need evidence of what was really happening. Thursday morning brought another call with another elaborate excuse. Rebecca now had food poisoning that required another day of recovery, and they couldn't risk the drive home while she was still so weak. When I suggested coming to check on her, Michael quickly shut that down, saying the hotel had strict health protocols about visitors, and they didn't want to risk exposing me to whatever Rebecca had caught. By Thursday afternoon, I was managing Emma and Jake's complete daily routine: school pickup and drop-off, meals, homework, bath time, bedtime, while their parents posted increasingly elaborate content from their secret luxury vacation. The Instagram stories showed spa treatments, expensive meals, couples massages, and romantic sunset photos. They were clearly having the time of their lives while I handled all of their parental responsibilities for free. Friday morning brought a call that pushed my growing suspicion into outright disbelief. "Mom, Rebecca's feeling a bit better, but we want to make sure she's completely recovered before attempting the drive home. We're going to stay one more day to be absolutely certain. Michael, the children miss you. Emma asked me 3 times yesterday when Mommy and Daddy were coming home. They're fine with you, Mom. They love spending time with their grandmother." "That's not the point, Michael. They need their parents. We'll be home tomorrow evening for sure, I promise." But the Instagram evidence told a different story. Rebecca's posts showed her ziplining, hiking, and enjoying what looked like a full itinerary of resort activities. She was clearly not recovering from food poisoning. She was living her best life at an expensive vacation destination. By Friday afternoon, I had been taking care of Emma and Jake for 4 consecutive days, managing every aspect of their lives. While their parents enjoyed a luxury vacation that they were financing with money, I had helped them earn and a house I had helped them buy. But the real betrayal, the moment that changed everything, came when my car broke down on the way to Boulder to get some of my own clothes and medications. I had taken Emma and Jake to school Friday morning and decided to make a quick trip back to Boulder to pick up some of my medications and a few changes of clothes. My plan was to be back in Highlands Ranch before the kids got out of school at 3 p.m. My 2015 Honda Civic had been reliable for years, but 20 miles north of Highlands Ranch on Highway 85, it started making terrible grinding noises and began smoking from under the hood. I managed to pull into a Shell gas station before the engine died completely, but it was clear that this was a serious mechanical problem. I called Michael immediately. "Michael, my car broke down and I'm stranded at a gas station on Highway 85. I need someone to come get me so I can be back before Emma and Jake get out of school." "Mom, we're still at the resort. Rebecca's finally feeling better, but we're not planning to drive back until this evening." "Michael, I need help. I'm stranded. And someone needs to pick up your children. Can't you call a tow truck or take an Uber?" I felt a cold shock at his casual dismissal of my situation. "Sweetheart, a tow truck will take hours, and an Uber back to Highlands Ranch will cost over $100. I need you to come get me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, we're really not in a position to leave right now. Can you figure something else out?" "Michael, I've been taking care of your children for 4 days while you and Rebecca have been on vacation. The least you can do is help me when I'm in an emergency situation." "We haven't been on vacation, Mom. Rebecca's been sick." "Michael, I've seen the Instagram posts. I know exactly where you are and what you've been doing." Another long pause, and then his voice turned cold in a way I'd never heard before. "Mom, you're being dramatic. We'll figure out the kid pickup situation, but we can't drop everything to rescue you every time you have a problem. You're an adult. Handle it." And then he hung up on me. I stood there in that gas station parking lot, 70 years old, stranded 20 miles from anywhere, holding a dead phone and realizing that my son, the boy I had raised as a single mother, put through college debt-free, helped buy a house, and supported through every challenge of his adult life, had just abandoned me because helping his mother would inconvenience his luxury vacation. But the worst part came 20 minutes later. Called Emma's school to explain that there might be a delay in pickup, only to learn that Michael had already called and arranged for both children to go home with their friend's family, because Grandma Margaret had an emergency and couldn't be there. He had replaced me before my car had even finished cooling down. As I sat on a bench outside that gas station, waiting for a tow truck that would cost me $300 I hadn't budgeted for, I felt something I had never experienced in my entire 70 years of life, complete abandonment by my own child. But what Michael didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn in all his 35 years, was that the mother he had just discarded like an inconvenient burden had spent 4 decades building and maintaining the cybersecurity systems that protected 3 of Colorado's largest banks. The woman he thought was technologically hopeless had been one of the first female specialists in electronic banking security, had helped design the fraud prevention protocols that protected millions of customers, and had security clearances and access capabilities that he couldn't even imagine. The mother he assumed would just accept this humiliation and quietly disappear from his life was about to teach him a lesson about the consequences of underestimating Margaret Elizabeth Chen when she stopped trying to be the grateful, accommodating parent and started being the banking security expert who had never lost a case involving financial fraud in 40 years of professional practice. Michael thought he had solved his problem by abandoning me at that gas station. He had actually created a much bigger problem by giving me the motivation I needed to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own choices, and those consequences were going to be spectacular. To understand how my son could abandon his own mother at a gas station without a second thought, you need to understand Rebecca Walsh, the woman who transformed my loving, considerate boy into someone I barely recognized. But here's the thing about master manipulators. They're incredibly good at making everyone else look like the problem while they systematically destroy relationships from the inside out. Rebecca entered our lives like a perfectly choreographed performance, and it took me 3 years to realize that everything about her was calculated to achieve maximum control with minimum accountability. When Michael first introduced me to Rebecca at a family barbecue in the summer of 2021, my immediate impression was overwhelmingly positive. She was 28 years old, strikingly beautiful in that effortless way that actually requires enormous effort, and she had the kind of warm, engaging personality that made everyone in the room want to be her friend. "Mrs. Chen, Michael has told me so much about you," she said, giving me a hug that felt genuine and warm. "He's so proud of everything you accomplished raising him as a single mother. That must have taken incredible strength and determination. I was immediately charmed." Rebecca seemed genuinely interested in learning about my life, asking thoughtful questions about my career at the bank, my hobbies in retirement, and my experiences as a single parent. She complimented my potato salad, laughed at my stories about Michael's childhood antics, and seemed to hang on every word when I talked about my late husband, David. "Michael, your mother is absolutely wonderful," she said later that evening, loud enough for me to overhear from the kitchen where I was cleaning up. "I can see where you get your kindness and work ethic. I hope I can be half the mother she was when we have children someday." That comment should have been my first warning sign, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Rebecca was already positioning herself as my successor in Michael's life, someone who would love him when rather than if they had children together. She was planting seeds about a future that assumed she would replace my role as the primary woman in his life. But in that moment, hearing my son's girlfriend praise my parenting and express hopes for their future family, I felt nothing but warmth and approval. Rebecca seemed like exactly the kind of woman I'd always hoped Michael would find. Someone who appreciated him, understood his values, and wanted to build a life that honored the foundation we'd created together. Over the following months, Rebecca made a concerted effort to build what appeared to be a genuine relationship with me. She would call me independently of Michael, just to chat about her day or ask for advice about dealing with work stress. She remembered details about my friends and activities, asking follow-up questions about my book club discussions or my volunteer work at the local animal shelter. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly," she said during one of these early conversations. "But I wanted to ask your opinion about something. Michael's been working such long hours lately, and I'm worried he's getting burned out. How did you help him manage stress when he was younger?" These conversations made me feel valued and included in their relationship in ways I'd never experienced with Michael's previous girlfriends. Rebecca seemed to genuinely want my guidance and insight, treating me like a wise mentor rather than an obstacle to navigate around. But what I didn't realize was that these conversations were intelligence-gathering missions designed to help Rebecca understand the dynamics of our family so she could eventually manipulate them to her advantage. Every detail I shared about Michael's personality, every story I told about our family traditions, every piece of advice I offered about managing his moods and preferences, all of it was being cataloged and analyzed to help Rebecca position herself as the perfect girlfriend who understood him better than anyone else ever had. When Michael and Rebecca announced their engagement 8 months later, I was genuinely thrilled. Rebecca had continued to be warm and inclusive, involving me in wedding planning discussions and asking for my input on everything from venue selections to menu choices. "Margaret, I know traditional etiquette says the bride's family should handle most of the wedding planning, Rebecca said during one of our many coffee dates. But my mother passed away when I was in college, and my relationship with my stepmother has always been complicated. Would you be willing to help me navigate some of the bigger decisions? I'd love to have your guidance. I was deeply moved by her request. The idea that Rebecca wanted me to step into a maternal role for her wedding planning felt like a tremendous honor, and I threw myself into helping her create the celebration of her dreams. We spent weekends touring venues, tasting cakes, and meeting with photographers. Rebecca seemed to genuinely value my opinions, often saying things like, "What do you think, Margaret? You have such good taste." Or, "I trust your judgment completely. Which option do you prefer?" But looking back now, I can see that Rebecca was using these planning sessions to establish patterns that would serve her later. She was training me to be available for whatever she needed, whenever she needed it, while positioning my help as essential to her happiness and success. The wedding itself was beautiful, an elegant affair at the Denver Botanic Gardens with 150 guests, professional photography, and catering that cost more than many people's annual salaries. Michael looked handsome and happy in his custom tuxedo, and Rebecca was absolutely radiant in a designer gown that she'd found with my help during a shopping trip to Dallas. I paid for the flowers, a $4,000 arrangement that Rebecca had fallen in love with, but couldn't afford on their budget. I also covered the photography upgrade that would give them additional hours of coverage and a complimentary engagement album. My total contribution to their wedding was nearly $15,000. Money I was happy to spend to help them start their marriage with the celebration they'd dreamed of. "Margaret, I can never thank you enough for everything you've done," Rebecca said during the mother-son dance, pulling me aside for a private moment. "You've made this day absolutely perfect, and I'm so grateful to be joining your family. The time, I felt like I was gaining a daughter rather than losing a son." Rebecca seemed to appreciate everything I brought to their relationship, and I looked forward to years of close family bonds and shared experiences. But the transformation began almost immediately after they returned from their honeymoon in Italy. The changes started so gradually that I didn't recognize them as a coordinated campaign until much later. Rebecca didn't suddenly become cold or hostile. That would have been too obvious and would have triggered Michael's protective instincts. Instead, she began a systematic process of repositioning me from beloved family member to well-meaning, but problematic outsider who needed to be managed rather than embraced. The first shift came in how my visits to their new house were framed and scheduled. During their engagement, I had an open invitation to drop by whenever I wanted, and Rebecca always seemed genuinely happy to see me. After the wedding, my visits became appointments that needed to be scheduled in advance and confirmed closer to the date. "Margaret, I love having you over, but with Michael's new position at the firm, our schedule has become so unpredictable," Rebecca explained during one of our phone conversations. "Would it be easier if we planned your visits a week or two ahead of time? That way I can make sure we're both here and can give you our full attention." This seemed reasonable on the surface. Michael had indeed been promoted to a senior advisory role that required more client meetings and travel. But what I didn't realize was that Rebecca was creating a system where my access to my son had to be approved and coordinated through her. The second shift was more subtle, but ultimately more damaging. Rebecca began reframing my personality traits and behaviors in ways that made them seem problematic rather than positive. My enthusiasm about their lives became overwhelming excitement that created pressure. My offers to help with household tasks became taking over in ways that made Rebecca feel inadequate. My suggestions about activities or restaurants became having strong opinions that influenced their decision-making. "Margaret, you know how much we appreciate your excitement about our new house," Rebecca said during one visit where I'd spent considerable time admiring their furniture choices and asking about their decorating plans. "But sometimes it feels like you have such specific ideas about what we should do that it's hard to figure out what we actually want ourselves." "I'm sorry, dear. I didn't realize I was being pushy. I'm just excited to see how you're building your life together. Oh, you're not being pushy at all. It's just that Michael and I are still figuring out our own style as a couple, and when you have such clear preferences, it makes us second-guess our own instincts. This was the beginning of a pattern that would continue for the next 3 years. Rebecca would present my normal family behaviors as problems that needed to be solved, while simultaneously reassuring me that she wasn't criticizing me personally. The genius of this approach was that it made me responsible for managing her emotional comfort rather than addressing any actual problems with my behavior. If I disagreed with her assessment, I was being defensive. If I tried to modify my behavior, I was confirming that I had indeed been problematic. The third shift involved gradually excluding me from activities and decisions while making the exclusion seem like it was for my own benefit. Margaret, Michael, and I are going to look at cribs this weekend, but I know furniture shopping can be really tiring, and you've been so busy with your volunteer work lately, Rebecca would say. Why don't we handle the initial research, and then if we find something, we can bring you back to see it? Of course, they would never bring me back to see anything, and by the time their decisions were made, my input was no longer relevant or needed. Or, we're thinking about trying that new restaurant downtown, but I know you're not crazy about spicy food, and their menu is pretty limited for people with dietary restrictions. Maybe we should wait until we find somewhere that would be more enjoyable for everyone? But they would go to the restaurant without me, and I would only learn about it later when Rebecca posted Instagram photos of their spontaneous date night. This pattern extended to everything from baby shower planning, too stressful for someone my age, to holiday celebrations, too much work when I was trying to enjoy retirement, to family vacations, too expensive and complicated when they were trying to be budget conscious. Each exclusion was presented as consideration for my well-being, but the cumulative effect was that I became increasingly peripheral to their lives and decisions. When Emma was born in the spring of 2022, I thought Rebecca's manipulative patterns would naturally resolve themselves. Surely becoming a grandmother would restore my central role in the family, and surely new parents would appreciate having an experienced, devoted family member who was eager to help. I was right about one thing. They definitely wanted my help. But what I didn't anticipate was how Rebecca would use my devotion to my granddaughter as a tool to extract free labor, while simultaneously positioning me as someone whose involvement required careful management. Margaret, having you here when we brought Emma home was such a blessing, Rebecca said during one of my early visits to meet my granddaughter. I don't know how new mothers survive without family support. You're going to be such an important part of Emma's life. I was over the moon, holding my granddaughter for the first time, seeing Michael's tender care with his daughter, watching Rebecca navigate the challenges of new motherhood. Everything felt like the natural evolution of our family bonds. Rebecca seemed overwhelmed and grateful for my help during those early weeks. I would come over for a few hours at a time, holding Emma while Rebecca napped, helping with laundry and meal preparation, sharing stories about Michael's infancy that seemed to reassure Rebecca that she was doing everything right. You're such a natural grandmother, Rebecca would say as I rocked Emma to sleep. She's so calm when you hold her. I think she already knows how much you love her. But within a few months, the dynamic began to shift in ways that should have alerted me to what was really happening. My voluntary offers to help became expected assistance. Rebecca would call and say, I'm having such a difficult day with Emma's feeding schedule. Could you come over for a few hours? And when I arrived, I would find Rebecca perfectly put together, heading out for a hair appointment or lunch with friends while I managed Emma's care. I'm so sorry to do this to you, Rebecca would say, grabbing her purse and keys. But this appointment has been scheduled for weeks, and Emma's been so fussy today that I haven't had a chance to shower or get myself together. You don't mind, do you? How could I mind spending time with my granddaughter? How could I prioritize my own convenience over my daughter-in-law's mental health and self-care needs? But gradually, I began to realize that my help was being used to enable Rebecca's lifestyle rather than to provide emergency support during genuinely difficult times. When I arrived for one of these emergency babysitting sessions, I would find Emma perfectly content, recently fed, and ready for a nap. The emergency had been Rebecca's desire to go shopping or meet friends for coffee, not any actual crisis requiring immediate assistance. My offers to help became obligations that were difficult to decline without seeming selfish or unsupportive. Rebecca developed a talent for presenting her requests in ways that made refusing seem like I was prioritizing my own comfort over my granddaughter's well-being. "Margaret, I hate to ask, but I have this work opportunity that could really help. Our financial situation and the meeting is during Emma's nap time," Rebecca would say. "I know you probably have other things planned, but would there be any way you could watch her for just a couple of hours?" What work opportunity? Rebecca's Instagram influencer activities were sporadic and didn't seem to generate any meaningful income. But how could I question whether she was telling the truth about opportunities that might help their financial stability? When Jake was born 2 years later, the pattern intensified exponentially. Now Rebecca needed help managing 2 children, and her requests for assistance became more frequent, longer in duration, and more demanding in scope. "Margaret, I know this is a lot to ask, but could you take both kids for the day on Saturday? Michael has a client golf tournament, and I have this opportunity to collaborate with a major brand on a sponsored post, but it requires a full day of filming and editing." A full day turned into 8 hours. 2 children turned into managing complete daily routines, including meals, activities, transportation, and behavioral guidance. Occasional help turned into 3 or 4 days per week of what was essentially full-time childcare. But the most insidious aspect of this arrangement was how Rebecca framed my increasing involvement in ways that made me responsible for maintaining the system that was exploiting my time and energy. "Margaret, the kids absolutely love their time with you," Rebecca would say. "You're such a wonderful grandmother, and they're so lucky to have someone who cares about them as much as you do. I hope we're not asking too much of you, but you always seem so happy when you're with them." This put me in an impossible position. If I expressed any concerns about the frequency or duration of my childcare responsibilities, I was essentially saying that I didn't enjoy spending time with my grandchildren. If I suggested that Rebecca and Michael should arrange alternative childcare, I was implying that they weren't good parents, or that I didn't want to be involved in Emma and Jake's lives. Rebecca had created a system where my exploitation was disguised as my choice, where my labor was framed as my privilege, and where any resistance to the arrangement was positioned as evidence that I didn't love my grandchildren enough to make sacrifices for their well-being. What I didn't understand until much later was how Rebecca was using social media to create a public narrative about our family dynamic that served her interests while undermining my position as the respected family matriarch. Rebecca's Instagram account, A Living Life Becca, had grown to over 75,000 followers during the first 2 years of her marriage to Michael. Her content focused on authentic motherhood, family values, and creating a beautiful life on a budget. Themes that resonated with other young mothers who were trying to balance family responsibilities with personal aspirations. But Rebecca's version of authentic motherhood relied heavily on my unpaid labor, though her followers had no way of knowing that. When Rebecca posted photos of elaborate birthday parties for Emma and Jake, complete with handmade decorations, custom cakes, and perfectly coordinated outfits, her followers saw a dedicated mother who was willing to invest time and creativity in making her children's celebrations special. What they didn't see was that I had spent hours helping with decorations. I had baked and decorated the cakes, and I had driven all over Denver to find the specific supplies that Rebecca needed to achieve her vision. When Rebecca shared posts about family adventures to museums, parks, and local attractions, her followers saw a family that prioritized educational experiences and quality time together. What they didn't see was that I was usually the one researching these activities, coordinating the logistics, and often paying for admission fees and meals while Rebecca focused on taking Instagram-worthy photos. When Rebecca posted content about maintaining work-life balance as a mother, her followers saw someone who was successfully juggling parenting responsibilities with professional opportunities. What they didn't see was that her work-life balance was only possible because I was providing between 20 and 30 hours of free childcare every week. But perhaps most damaging was how Rebecca used social media to position herself as the primary grandmother figure in Emma and Jake's lives, while subtly minimizing my role and contributions. Rebecca would post photos of herself baking cookies with the children, with captions like, "Nothing beats quality time in the kitchen with my little helpers," teaching them young that the best treats are made with love. But I was usually the one who had planned the baking activity, gathered the ingredients, and guided the children through the process while Rebecca focused on capturing the perfect shot. She would share posts about family traditions, like holiday, decorating, or summer garden projects, presenting them as activities that she and Michael had initiated and maintained. But most of these traditions had been established during my visits, planned around my availability, and executed with my guidance and financial support. Rebecca had figured out how to monetize my grandmother activities for her social media brand while positioning herself as the creative, devoted parent who was responsible for all the positive experiences in her children's lives. The most painful example of this manipulation came during Emma's 4th birthday party in 2023. I had spent 2 weeks helping Rebecca plan and prepare for an elaborate princess-themed celebration that required handmade decorations, a custom cake, and coordinated activities for 15 children. I had paid for the decorations, baked and decorated the cake, and managed most of the party logistics while Rebecca focused on documenting everything for her Instagram content. But when Rebecca posted her recap of the party, the narrative was entirely about her dedication as a mother and her creativity in creating magical experiences for her daughter. The photos showed Rebecca interacting with the children, cutting the cake, and facilitating activities, while I was completely absent from the visual story. Emma's 4th birthday was absolutely magical. Her caption read, "Planning parties can be so stressful, but seeing her face light up when she saw her princess castle cake made every minute of preparation worth it. There's nothing I wouldn't do to make my baby's dreams come true." Authentic motherhood. Princess party. Birthday magic. The post received over 2,000 likes and hundreds of comments praising Rebecca's creativity, dedication, and parenting skills. Her followers had no idea that the magical party they were admiring had been primarily planned, funded, and executed by the grandmother who didn't appear in any of the photos. This pattern extended to every aspect of family life. Rebecca's social media presence was built on content that showcased her as the ideal mother. But that ideal was only achievable because of my invisible labor and financial support. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Rebecca's manipulation was watching how it gradually transformed my relationship with Michael himself. The loving, considerate son who had always treated me with respect and appreciation slowly became someone who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be valued. This transformation didn't happen overnight. Rebecca was too smart to directly criticize me to Michael or to demand that he choose between us. Instead, she used subtle techniques to gradually shift his perception of our relationship dynamics. The first technique was reframing normal family interactions as evidence of boundary problems that needed to be addressed. When I would call Michael to check in or share news about my activities, Rebecca would later comment to him about how sweet it was that I was so involved in his life, but suggest that the frequency of our contact might indicate that I was having trouble letting go as he became more independent. "Michael, your mom called 3 times this week," Rebecca would say in a tone that suggested this was concerning rather than normal. "I hope she's not feeling too lonely since she retired. Maybe we should make sure she's developing her own social..." connections instead of relying on us for all her social needs. When I would offer advice or suggestions about decisions they were making, Rebecca would agree with me enthusiastically in the moment, but later tell Michael that she worried I was taking over their decision-making process in ways that might prevent them from developing confidence in their own judgment. "Your mom has such strong opinions about everything," Rebecca would say after I'd helped them research preschool options for Emma. "I appreciate her experience, but sometimes I feel like we don't get to figure things out for ourselves because she's already done all the research and has clear preferences about what we should choose." These conversations gradually convinced Michael that my enthusiastic involvement in their lives was evidence of an unhealthy attachment that was preventing him and Rebecca from establishing proper independence as a couple. The second technique was creating situations where Michael had to choose between my preferences and Rebecca's emotional needs, then positioning his choice as evidence of his commitment to their marriage. Rebecca would agree to plans that included me, then later express anxiety or discomfort about those plans in ways that made Michael feel responsible for protecting her emotional well-being. "Michael, I know your mom is excited about helping us with Emma's nursery, but I'm feeling really overwhelmed by how many people have opinions about what we should do," Rebecca would say after we'd spent a successful afternoon shopping for baby furniture. "I want Emma's room to reflect our style as parents, not just what other people think looks nice." Michael would then have to choose between moving forward with plans that excited me and protecting Rebecca from feeling overwhelmed by my involvement. Increasingly, he chose to protect Rebecca, which meant canceling plans with me or excluding me from activities I'd been looking forward to. "Mom, Rebecca's feeling a little stressed about all the nursery decisions," Michael would call to tell me. "We're going to handle the rest of the furniture shopping ourselves, but we'll definitely show you everything once it's set up." Each time Michael chose to prioritize Rebecca's comfort over my inclusion, Rebecca would reinforce his decision by praising his sensitivity to her needs and his commitment to protecting their relationship. "Thank you for understanding how I was feeling," she would tell him. "It means so much to me that you're willing to set boundaries when I need them. I feel so supported and protected when you prioritize our relationship like that." Over time, Michael began to see excluding me from activities and decisions as evidence of his maturity and his commitment to his marriage, rather than as hurtful rejection of someone who loved him and wanted to be involved in his life. The third technique was the most damaging. Rebecca began sharing concerns about my behavior and mental state that positioned me as someone who needed to be handled carefully rather than someone whose opinions and feelings should be respected. "Michael, I'm a little worried about your mom," Rebecca would say after visits, where I'd seemed perfectly normal and happy. "She seems really lonely since she retired, and I think she might be depending on us for social interaction more than is healthy for someone her age." Or, "I hope your mom isn't developing memory problems. She asked me the same question about Emma's preschool 3 times during our phone call yesterday, and she seemed confused about plans we'd already discussed." These concerns were presented as caring observations from a daughter-in-law who wanted the best for me, but they had the effect of making Michael view my normal behavior through a lens of worry and patronizing concern rather than respect and appreciation. When I would call to make plans or share exciting news, Michael would respond with the kind of careful, patient tone people use with elderly relatives they're worried about rather than the enthusiastic engagement he'd shown in our relationship for 35 years. "That's great, Mom," he would say, when I told him about a book club discussion I'd particularly enjoyed. "I'm glad you're staying active and involved in things." Staying active and involved in things. As if reading and discussing literature with friends was evidence that I was successfully managing the challenges of aging rather than simply living a normal, engaged life. By the time Rebecca was ready to execute her final manipulation, the luxury vacation disguised as a health emergency, Michael had been completely conditioned to see me as someone whose needs were less important than Rebecca's comfort. whose feelings were less valid than Rebecca's emotional state, and whose role in their family was something to be managed rather than something to be valued. The son who had once called me his best friend and most trusted advisor had become someone who could abandon me at a gas station without experiencing any guilt or concern for my well-being. And the most tragic part was that Michael genuinely believed this transformation represented his growth as a husband and his commitment to putting his marriage first, rather than recognizing it as the result of 3 years of systematic manipulation by someone who had never intended to welcome me into their family, only to use me until my usefulness was exhausted. But what neither Rebecca nor Michael understood was that the woman they had systematically underestimated and marginalized had spent 40 years in a profession that required her to detect patterns, analyze behavior, and identify threats that others missed. And I had been watching, documenting, and analyzing their behavior far more carefully than they realized. The woman they thought they had successfully sidelined was about to demonstrate exactly what happens when you underestimate someone whose professional expertise involves tracking, financial fraud, and identifying people who exploit systems for personal gain. Rebecca had made one crucial mistake in her 3-year campaign to control our family dynamics. She had assumed that I was exactly who I appeared to be on the surface, rather than investigating who I actually was underneath. And that assumption was about to cost them everything. Sitting on that bench outside the Shell station on Highway 85, watching my broken-down Honda leak oil onto the asphalt while I waited for a tow truck I couldn't afford, I experienced something I had never felt in my 70 years of life: the complete abandonment by my own child when I needed him most. But it wasn't just the abandonment that shattered something fundamental inside me. It was the casual cruelty with which Michael had dismissed my emergency, the obvious lies about Rebecca's illness, and the stunning realization that my son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love and sacrifice I possessed, had become someone who could prioritize his luxury vacation over his mother's safety without experiencing even a moment of guilt or concern. The tow truck arrived an hour and 20 minutes after I called, driven by a kind man named Roberto who took one look at my situation and immediately understood that this was more than just a mechanical breakdown. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked as he examined my Honda's engine. "Do you have someone coming to pick you up?" "I'm fine," I replied automatically, though we both knew that wasn't true. "I'll figure out how to get home." "This engine is completely shot," Roberto said after a few minutes of inspection. "Blown head gasket, probably damaged pistons. It's going to cost more to repair than the car is worth." I felt my chest tighten as I processed what he was telling me. My reliable Honda Civic, the car that had safely transported me to thousands of babysitting sessions, grocery runs for Rebecca's household, and emergency trips to help with grandchildren's needs, was essentially worthless scrap metal. "How much will it cost to tow it to a repair shop?" I asked, though I was already calculating how this unexpected expense would impact my carefully managed retirement budget. $300 to the nearest shop, but honestly, you'd be better off donating it for parts. Save yourself the towing fee and the storage costs while you decide what to do. I sat back down on the bench, feeling every one of my 70 years weighing on my shoulders. I had no car, no immediate way to get home, and no family member who considered my situation important enough to interrupt their luxury vacation. "Ma'am," Roberto said gently, "I can't leave you stranded here. My shift ends in an hour, and I live up near Boulder. If you don't mind riding in a tow truck, I can drop you at your house on my way home." The kindness of this stranger, a man who had never met me before and owed me nothing, stood in stark contrast to the casual abandonment I'd just experienced from my own son. I accepted Roberto's offer gratefully, and during the 45-minute drive to my house, I found myself telling him more about my situation than I had intended. "Your son left you stranded?" Roberto asked, his voice carrying the kind of disbelief that normal people feel when they hear about family members abandoning each other. "Where are his kids?" He arranged for friends to pick them up from school. He replaced me before he even hung up the phone. Roberto was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him processing the implications of what I'd told him. "Ma'am, I've got 3 kids and a mother who's about your age," he finally said. "If one of my boys ever treated their grandmother the way your son just treated you, they'd be hearing from me in ways they wouldn't forget. That's not how family is supposed to work." When Roberto dropped me off at my house, he refused to accept any payment for the ride. "You've got enough to worry about right now," he said. "Take care of yourself, and I hope your family situation improves." But as I stood in my driveway watching Roberto's tow truck disappear down the street, I knew that my family situation was never going to improve through hoping or waiting or trying to be more accommodating to Rebecca's needs. My family situation was going to improve when I stopped allowing myself to be treated like disposable help and started treating Michael and Rebecca like the adults they claimed to be, adults who were responsible for the consequences of their choices. That evening, alone in my house for the first time in 5 days, I did something I had never done before. I conducted a thorough investigation of Rebecca's social media presence during the time period when she was supposedly too sick to drive home from their business meeting. What I found was so extensive and damaging that it took me 3 hours to screenshot and organize all the evidence of their deception. Rebecca's Instagram stories from the past 4 days told the complete story of an expensive resort vacation, documented in real time with timestamps that made their lies impossible to deny. Wednesday evening, while I was putting Emma and Jake to bed and Michael was telling me that Rebecca was too ill to travel, Rebecca posting stories from the spa at the Broadmoor Resort in Colorado Springs, showing her getting a couples massage with Michael and captioning it, "Much-needed relaxation time." Couples retreat. Self-care. Thursday morning, while Michael was calling to tell me that Rebecca's food poisoning required another day of recovery, Rebecca posting videos from their private balcony showing a room service breakfast spread that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week, with captions about starting the day right and grateful for this beautiful morning. Thursday afternoon, while I was managing Emma's piano practice and Jake's preschool workbook, Rebecca sharing posts from the resort's adventure activities, including photos of her and Michael ziplining through the mountains and rock climbing on the resort's artificial wall. The timestamps showed these activities were happening during the exact hours when Michael was supposed to be caring for his sick wife. Friday morning, while Michael was calling to extend their stay because Rebecca was still too weak to drive, Rebecca posting Instagram stories from the resort's championship golf course, showing her and Michael having drinks at the 19th hole after completing what was obviously a full round of golf. But perhaps most damaging were the posts Rebecca had shared to her main Instagram feed, carefully curated content that revealed the true nature of their emergency business trip. A professional photo of Rebecca and Michael at what was clearly an expensive restaurant, both dressed in formal attire and raising champagne glasses, with a caption that read, "Sometimes you need to drop everything and prioritize your relationship." Michael surprised me with this spontaneous getaway to reconnect and recharge. 4 years of marriage and he still knows exactly what I need. Spontaneous adventures. Marriage goals, grateful. A collection of photos from various resort activities, spa treatments, fine dining, outdoor adventures, and luxury amenities, with a caption that explained exactly what had been happening while I managed their children's complete daily routines. Recap of our incredible 3-day retreat at a Fark the Broadmoor official. Sometimes the best trips are the ones you don't plan. Michael and I realized we desperately needed couple time, so we made it happen. Thanks to family support, we were able to focus completely on each other and remember why we fell in love. Feeling so refreshed and grateful. Couple time. Priorities. Blessed life. Family support. That was how Rebecca characterized my 4 days of unpaid labor, managing her children's complete care, while she enjoyed luxury resort amenities that cost more than many people's monthly salaries. But the post that pushed my anger into something approaching fury was a carousel of photos showing Rebecca and Michael enjoying various resort activities, with a caption that revealed the financial reality of their spontaneous vacation. Splurged on the premium package because life's too short not to treat yourself. Couples massage, private dining, adventure activities, and a sweet upgrade. Sometimes you have to invest in your relationship. Michael works so hard, and we both needed this reminder of what we're building together. Worth every penny. Invest in love. Life is short. No regrets. Worth every penny. Rebecca was bragging about spending money on luxury amenities while I provided free childcare that would have cost them at least $200 per day if they had hired professional help. During their 4-day emergency, they had spent approximately $3,000 on resort amenities, meals, and activities, while I had provided childcare services that would have cost them nearly $1,000 if they had hired qualified professionals. They had the financial resources to spend money on luxury vacation experiences, but they were using lies and manipulation to extract free labor from someone whose retirement budget couldn't absorb the cost of an unexpected car repair. As I compiled this evidence, I began to understand that this wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment or insensitive behavior. This was the culmination of a 3-year pattern of exploitation that had been carefully disguised as family support and emergency assistance. Rebecca and Michael had been using my devotion to my grandchildren and my desire to be helpful as a way to subsidize their lifestyle, while simultaneously marginalizing my role in the family and dismissing my value as a person worthy of respect and consideration. But what they didn't understand, what they had never bothered to learn, was that the woman they had been systematically exploiting and underestimating had spent 40 years developing expertise in detecting exactly this kind of fraudulent behavior. That night, as I sat in my home office surrounded by screenshots of Rebecca's social media evidence, I experienced something I hadn't felt since my retirement 5 years earlier. The sharp, focused clarity that came with applying my professional expertise to solve a complex problem. For 40 years, my job at First National Bank of Colorado had been to identify patterns of fraudulent behavior, analyze financial irregularities, and build cases against people who exploited systems for personal gain. I had investigated everything, from credit card fraud to elaborate money laundering schemes, and I had developed an instinct for recognizing when someone's public behavior didn't match their private actions. Looking at Rebecca's Instagram posts with my professional analyst mindset rather than my emotional grandmother perspective, I could see patterns that I had been trained to recognize but had been too personally invested to identify. Pattern 1. Financial inconsistency. Rebecca and Michael claimed to be budget-conscious young parents who needed my help with childcare because they couldn't afford professional services. But Rebecca's social media showed consistent spending on luxury items, expensive experiences, and premium services that contradicted their claims of financial constraint. Pattern 2. Systematic deception. The elaborate lies about Rebecca's illness weren't spontaneous mistakes or poor communication. They were part of a coordinated deception that required planning, consistency, and ongoing maintenance. This was fraud, not miscommunication. Pattern 3. Exploitation of trust. My role as the loving grandmother who wanted to help had been weaponized to extract services that would have cost them significant money if they had obtained them legitimately. They were using emotional manipulation to commit what was essentially theft of services. Pattern 4. Escalating entitlement. Over 3 years, their requests for help had become more frequent, more demanding, and more presumptuous. This was the classic pattern of fraudsters who test boundaries, increase their exploitation gradually, and become more careless as they assume their victims will continue accepting whatever treatment they receive. As I analyzed these patterns, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the professional satisfaction that came with identifying a clear case of fraud and beginning to build an investigation that would expose the truth. But this wasn't just professional interest. This was personal in ways that made my 40 years of banking security experience feel like preparation for the most important case of my career. I had spent decades protecting strangers from people who exploited trust for financial gain. Now, I was going to protect myself from family members who had been doing exactly the same thing. Over the next several hours, my professional investigation mindset led me to dig deeper into Rebecca and Michael's financial behavior patterns, and what I discovered made their casual abandonment of me seem like only the tip of a much larger iceberg of deception and exploitation. Using the same research techniques I had employed for banking fraud investigations, I began examining Rebecca's social media history more systematically, looking for evidence of patterns that might reveal the scope of their deceptive behavior. What I found was 3 years of documentation showing that almost every emergency that had required my childcare assistance had coincided with Rebecca's social media posts about luxury activities, expensive purchases, or recreational experiences that contradicted the urgent needs they had described to me. The crucial business meeting that required me to babysit for 8 hours in July had actually been a day-long wine-tasting event in Napa Valley that Rebecca had documented extensively on her Instagram stories. The unexpected client dinner that required me to stay overnight with the children in August had actually been a weekend getaway to Aspen that Rebecca had posted about using hashtags like Cheer Couple Time and Sean Weekend Retreat. The family emergency that required me to provide childcare for 3 consecutive days in September had actually been Rebecca's participation in a luxury wellness retreat that cost $2,500 per person and included activities like private yoga sessions, organic meal preparation classes, and guided meditation workshops. Each of these events had required advanced planning, significant financial investment, and coordination that proved they weren't the spontaneous emergencies they had been presented as when I was asked to provide childcare. But perhaps most damaging was what I discovered when I examined the financial timeline of their major purchases and expenses in relation to my contributions to their household. The $200,000 I had provided for their house down payment had been used exactly as intended. But Rebecca's social media showed that within 6 months of moving into their new house, they had spent an additional $75,000 on furniture, landscaping, and home renovation projects that transformed their house into the luxury showcase that provided the backdrop for Rebecca's Instagram content. The $15,000 I had contributed to their wedding had been supplemented by another $25,000 in upgrades and additions that Rebecca had documented on social media but never mentioned to me. Their budget-conscious wedding had actually cost over $40,000, with the additional expenses going toward premium photographer packages, luxury transportation, and reception upgrades that supported Rebecca's vision of creating content for her social media brand. The pattern was clear. They were using my financial contributions to establish their basic security and stability, while using their own financial resources to fund lifestyle choices that supported Rebecca's public image and personal enjoyment. Meanwhile, they were using my labor contributions to subsidize their lifestyle in ways that freed up their time and money for activities that I was never informed about and never invited to participate in. I had been functioning as their unpaid employee and their silent financial backer, while they enjoyed the benefits of my support without acknowledging my contributions or considering my needs and preferences. But what truly pushed my growing anger into something approaching fury was discovering the extent to which Rebecca had been monetizing her family content that relied heavily on my unpaid labor and financial support for her own professional and financial benefit. As I dug deeper into Rebecca's social media presence, I began to understand that her lifestyle influencer activities weren't the hobby-level content creation I had assumed they were. Rebecca had developed a sophisticated business model that generated significant income through sponsored posts, affiliate marketing, and brand partnerships. Her Instagram account, A Living Life Becca, had grown to over 85,000 followers, and her engagement Rates were high enough to command premium pricing for sponsored content. But what was most shocking was discovering that the family content that generated the highest engagement and the most lucrative brand partnerships was content that featured Emma and Jake, content that relied entirely on my unpaid childcare to create. Rebecca's most successful posts were the ones that showed her as the devoted, creative mother who was constantly engaged in educational activities, craft projects, and special experiences with her children. But I now realized that these posts were only possible because I was providing the actual childcare that freed Rebecca to focus on content creation and curation. When Rebecca posted content about rainy day activities, showing her doing art projects with Emma and Jake, the reality was that I had planned the activities, gathered the supplies, and managed the children's participation while Rebecca focused on getting the perfect shots for her Instagram content. When Rebecca shared posts about teaching life skills in the kitchen, showing her baking cookies with the children, the reality was that I had prepared all the ingredients, guided the children through the process, and handled the cleanup while Rebecca documented the experience for her social media. Burnt when Rebecca posted about adventure days showing family trips to museums, parks, and local attractions, the reality was that I had researched the activities, coordinated the logistics, often paid for admission and expenses, and managed the children's needs throughout the day while Rebecca focused on creating content that portrayed her as the fun, engaged parent who prioritized educational experiences. But perhaps most infuriating was discovering that Rebecca had recently begun accepting paid partnerships with companies that sold parenting products, educational materials, and family experience services. She was being compensated to recommend products and services to her followers based on her reputation as an authentic mother who made thoughtful choices about her children's well-being and development. The reputation that was generating this income was built on content that showcased parenting activities and family experiences that were only possible because of my invisible labor and financial support. Rebecca was literally being paid to portray herself as the kind of mother who had the time, energy, and resources to provide enriching experiences for her children, when the reality was that those experiences were primarily planned, funded, and supervised by the grandmother who never appeared in any of the posts I had been subsidizing. Rebecca's business model, while she profited from content that misrepresented the source of her parenting success. Armed with this new understanding of how I had been systematically exploited, I decided to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the financial impact of my 3 years of support for Michael and Rebecca's household. Using the same analytical techniques I had employed for banking fraud investigations, I calculated the monetary value of all the services, support, and direct financial contributions I had provided since their wedding. Direct financial contributions, house down payment, $200,000 wedding contributions, $15,000 car repairs and maintenance. For Rebecca's vehicle, $3,200 emergency financial assistance, medical bills, unexpected expenses, $8,500 holiday and birthday gifts for family, $12,000 home improvement and furniture purchases, $18,000 total, $256,700 childcare services, average 25 hours per week for 3 years, our 3,900 hours, professional childcare rate in Highlands, ranch, $18 per hour, total value, $70,200 additional services, meal preparation and household assistance, $15,600 transportation services for children, $4,800 event planning and coordination, $8,400 emergency assistance, and support, $6,200 total, $35,000 grand. Total, $361,900. In 3 years, I had provided over $360,000 in financial contributions and services to Michael and Rebecca's household. This was more than Michael's annual salary, and it represented nearly half of my total retirement savings and pension income. But what made this calculation even more shocking was realizing that none of these contributions had been acknowledged, appreciated, or reciprocated in any meaningful way. I had never received a thank you card for my financial contributions. never been invited to participate in decisions about how my money was being used, and never been consulted about whether I was comfortable with the level of support I was providing. My childcare services had been treated as my obligation rather than my gift, with Rebecca and Michael scheduling my time and extending my commitments without asking whether I had other plans or preferences. The additional services I provided, cooking, cleaning, transportation, event planning, had been accepted as natural, extensions of my grandmother role, rather than significant contributions that deserved recognition and appreciation. I had been treated like a resource to be utilized, rather than a person whose contributions were valued and whose needs mattered. But perhaps most painful was realizing that Michael and Rebecca had been comfortable taking this level of support from me while simultaneously excluding me from family decisions, marginalizing my opinions, and treating my preferences as less important than their convenience. They had been willing to accept everything I could give them while giving me nothing in return except access to my grandchildren, access that they controlled and could revoke whenever it suited their purposes. Sitting in my home office at 2 a.m., surrounded by spreadsheets calculating the financial impact of my exploitation and screenshots, documenting 3 years of systematic deception, I experienced a moment of absolute clarity about my situation and my options. I could continue accepting this treatment, hoping that Michael and Rebecca would eventually recognize my value and start treating me with the respect and consideration I deserved. I could try to have rational conversations about boundaries and expectations, hoping that they would become more reasonable and appreciative. Or I could stop hoping that people who had spent 3 years demonstrating their character would somehow transform into different people and start responding to their behavior with the same professionalism and strategic thinking I had used in my banking career when dealing with people who exploited systems for personal gain. For 40 years, when I identified patterns of financial fraud and exploitation, my job hadn't been to hope that the fraudsters would reform their behavior or to try to educate them about why their actions were harmful. My job had been to gather evidence, build a case, and implement consequences that would stop the fraudulent behavior and protect the people and institutions being exploited. Michael and Rebecca had been committing fraud against me for 3 years. They had been stealing services, manipulating me through false pretenses, and exploiting my emotional attachment to my grandchildren to extract financial and labor contributions that they had no intention of reciprocating or even acknowledging. The fact that they were family members didn't change the fundamental nature of their behavior. If anything, it made their actions more reprehensible because they were violating trust and exploiting love in ways that strangers couldn't access. But what Michael and Rebecca didn't understand, what they had never bothered to learn, was that the woman they had been systematically defrauding had spent 40 years developing expertise in exactly the kind of financial investigation and strategic response that their situation required. They had assumed that I was a typical elderly grandmother, whose primary concerns were staying connected to family and avoiding conflict. They had never considered the possibility that I might have professional capabilities that could be deployed against them if they pushed me too far. They had made the classic mistake that fraudsters often make. They had underestimated their victim and overestimated their own cleverness. But I was done being their victim. I was ready to become their problem. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up with the kind of mental clarity I hadn't experienced since my most challenging banking fraud cases. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I had the professional expertise to do it effectively. My phone had 17 missed calls and 12 text messages from Michael and Rebecca, all of them expressing increasing panic about their situation and demanding that I resolve the childcare crisis they had created by abandoning me. "Mom, we've been trying to reach you all night. We need you to pick up Emma and Jake from the Hendersons and take them for the weekend. Rebecca is still feeling terrible, and we can't drive back until she's better. Margaret, please call us back. The kids are asking for you, and we really need your help managing this situation. Mom, this is an emergency. We need you to handle the kids until we can get back. Please don't make this more difficult than it already is. Reading these messages, I felt a calm, professional detachment that I recognized from my banking career. This was how I felt when I had gathered sufficient evidence to build a fraud case and was ready to begin implementing consequences. Michael and Rebecca were experiencing their first taste of what happened when the person they had been exploiting was no longer available to solve their problems. They were panicking because their exploitation system had suddenly failed, and they had no backup plan for managing their responsibilities without my unpaid labor. But instead of recognizing that their panic was the result of their own choices and behavior, they were demanding that I fix the problems they had created and continue providing the services they had been taking for granted. They still saw me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person whose feelings and needs mattered. That was about to change. I turned off my phone and began making the calls that would transform me from Margaret Chen, the exploited grandmother, into Margaret Chen, the banking security specialist with 40 years of experience in financial investigation and fraud prevention. The woman who had been abandoned at a gas station was about to become the woman who would teach Michael and Rebecca the most expensive lesson of their lives. And unlike their luxury resort vacation, this lesson was going to cost them everything. While Michael and Rebecca spent their Saturday morning frantically calling my disconnected phone and scrambling to find alternative childcare for Emma and Jake, I was sitting in my home office accessing computer systems that most people didn't even know existed. What my family had never understood, what they had never bothered to investigate despite 3 years of assuming I was technologically incompetent, was that Margaret Elizabeth Chen wasn't just a retired bank employee who had worked with computers. I was one of the most senior cybersecurity specialists in the history of Colorado banking, with security clearances, system access, and professional relationships that could make or break financial institutions across the entire Rocky Mountain region. The computer setup in my modest Boulder home office wasn't the basic desktop system that Michael dismissively helped me troubleshoot when he wanted to demonstrate his technological superiority. It was a custom-built cybersecurity workstation with encrypted connections to banking networks, law enforcement databases, and financial investigation systems that required federal clearance levels most people could never achieve. For 40 years, I had been one of the people banks called when they discovered fraud that was too sophisticated for their standard security protocols to detect. I had been the specialist that federal agents consulted when they needed expert testimony about cybercrime, patterns that crossed state lines. I had been the analyst that other cybersecurity professionals referenced when they needed to understand emerging threats in electronic banking fraud. My retirement 5 years earlier hadn't ended my access to these systems. It had simply changed. My status from full-time employee to consultant specialist. First National Bank of Colorado retained me on a $50,000 annual consulting contract specifically to maintain my clearances and availability for complex fraud investigations that required my particular expertise. The woman Michael thought needed help setting up her Netflix account actually held top-secret security clearances with the Treasury Department, maintained active consulting relationships with 3 federal agencies, and had her fingerprints on the cybersecurity protocols that protected over $2 billion in customer assets across 7 different banking institutions. But Michael had never asked about my work in any detail that would have revealed the scope of my professional accomplishments. Rebecca had never shown interest in my career beyond the polite, superficial questions that people ask when they want to appear engaged but aren't actually listening to the answers. They had both been perfectly content to assume that I was exactly what I appeared to be on the surface, a lonely widow who needed their guidance to navigate the basic challenges of modern life, whose primary value was providing free childcare and emergency financial assistance when their budget couldn't cover their lifestyle choices. Their assumptions were about to become the most expensive mistake of their lives. At 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, I began making the phone calls that would transform my situation from personal family drama into a professional fraud investigation with the full resources of Colorado's banking security network behind it. My first call was to Jennifer Martinez, the current director of cybersecurity at First National Bank of Colorado, and my former protege who had taken over most of my responsibilities when I retired. Jennifer and I had worked together for 15 years, and she had been the one to recommend that the bank retain me as a consulting specialist rather than losing my expertise entirely when I left full-time employment. Margaret? I wasn't expecting to hear from you on a weekend. Please tell me you're not calling about the Morrison Industries case, because I already told the FBI that we'd have their analysis ready by Monday. This isn't about Morrison Industries, Jen. This is personal, but it involves the kind of financial fraud patterns that I think you'll find professionally interesting. Personal fraud? Margaret, what's going on? Are you okay? I'm fine, but I've discovered that my son and daughter-in-law have been conducting systematic financial fraud against me for the past 3 years, and I need to access some of our investigation tools to build a comprehensive case. There was a long pause on Jennifer's end, and I could practically hear her shifting into the focused, analytical mindset that made her such an effective cybersecurity director. Margaret, when you say systematic financial fraud, what exactly are we talking about? Unauthorized access to your accounts? Identity theft? Elder abuse? All of the above, potentially. They've been using false pretenses to extract services and financial support. They've been lying about their own financial status to manipulate my contributions, and they've been exploiting their access to my personal information to maintain their exploitation system. I need to run a full financial forensics analysis to understand the complete scope of what they've been doing. Margaret, you know I'll help you with whatever you need, but if we're talking about potential criminal fraud, you might want to consider involving law enforcement from the beginning. That's exactly what I'm planning to do, but I want to build an airtight case before I start involving prosecutors. Can you get me access to the fraud analysis software this weekend? I want to run pattern recognition algorithms on 3 years of financial data. I can have you connected within an hour. Do you need me to come over and help with the technical setup? Jen, I've been running financial forensics investigations since before you graduated from college. I think I can handle the software. Jennifer laughed, and I could hear the respect and affection in her voice that reminded me why I had enjoyed mentoring her throughout her career. Of course you can. I'll send you the access credentials and case file protocols. Margaret, whatever your son and daughter-in-law have done, they have no idea what they're dealing with. You're about to give them a masterclass in consequences. My second call was to David Park, a supervisory special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division who had worked with me on dozens of banking fraud cases over the past 2 decades. David had been a junior agent when we first started collaborating, and he had often told people that working with me had taught him more about cybercrime investigation than his formal FBI training. Margaret Chen, are you calling to tell me you're bored with retirement and want to come back to work full-time? Because I have about 15 cases right now that could use your expertise. Actually, David, I'm calling because I need to report what appears to be a sophisticated case of elder financial abuse and fraud, and I want to make sure I'm building the investigation correctly from the beginning. David's tone immediately shifted from casual friendliness to professional concern. Margaret, are you saying someone has been targeting you for elder fraud? Because if that's what's happening, whoever is responsible has made a very serious mistake. It's my son and daughter-in-law. 3 years of systematic financial exploitation, false pretenses, and what appears to be organized fraud designed to extract maximum financial benefit while minimizing their own responsibilities and costs. Margaret, I'm going to need you to walk me through this from the beginning, but first I want you to know that elder financial abuse is a federal crime, and when it involves the kind of sophisticated planning you're describing, we prosecute it aggressively, especially when the perpetrators are stupid enough to target someone with your background and connections. David, I'm not looking for criminal prosecution at this point. I'm looking to build a case that will allow me to implement immediate financial consequences that will stop their fraudulent behavior and protect my assets from further exploitation. What kind of immediate consequences are you thinking about? The kind that demonstrate the difference between targeting a helpless elderly victim and targeting someone who has spent 40 years learning how to track, freeze, and recover fraudulently obtained assets. David was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of professional admiration that I hadn't heard directed toward me since my retirement. "Margaret, whatever you're planning, make sure you document everything according to federal evidence standards. Because when this is over, there's going to be a case study written about it, and I want to make sure we can use it for training purposes." My third call was to Patricia Rodriguez, a partner at Morrison, Kim and Associates, the law firm that had handled my banking contract negotiations for the past 20 years. Patricia specialized in financial law and elder rights, and she had become both a professional colleague and a personal friend during our years of working together. "Margaret, please tell me you're calling because you've decided to write a book about your banking career. I've been telling you for years that your case stories would make an incredible memoir. I'm calling because I need legal advice about financial fraud and elder abuse, but the situation is more complex than typical because I have professional knowledge and access that most elder abuse victims don't possess. Margaret, are you telling me that someone has been stupid enough to try to commit financial fraud against you? Because that might be the worst judgment call in the history of white-collar crime." I spent 20 minutes walking Patricia through the evidence I had gathered about Michael and Rebecca's systematic exploitation, the financial analysis I had conducted, and the professional resources I was planning to deploy in response to their behavior. "Margaret, what you're describing is a textbook case of elder financial abuse, with the added elements of fraud, false pretenses, and systematic exploitation. But here's what makes this situation particularly interesting from a legal standpoint. Your professional background and financial expertise mean that you have tools available for responding to this fraud that most victims don't have access to. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you. What are the legal boundaries around using my professional access and capabilities to protect my own financial interests?" "Margaret, as long as you're acting to protect your own assets and you're not accessing information or systems that you're not legally authorized to use, you have broad discretion to investigate and respond to fraud that's being committed against you. The fact that your professional background gives you more sophisticated tools than most people have access to doesn't create any legal restrictions on your ability to use those tools defensively. What about implementing financial consequences that go beyond just protecting my assets? Margaret, if someone has been committing fraud against you, you have legal grounds to pursue asset recovery, compensation for damages, and punitive measures that are proportional to the scope of the fraud. The key is documentation and proportionality. You need to be able to prove what they've done, and your response needs to be reasonable given the scope of their actions. Patricia, when this is over, I want them to understand exactly what they were stealing from and exactly what I'm capable of when I stop trying to protect them from the consequences of their own behavior. Margaret, given your professional background and the evidence you've described, I think you're in a position to provide them with a very expensive education about the risks of financial fraud. Just make sure you document everything, because this case is going to be studied by legal professionals for years. By noon on Saturday, I had access to the same fraud investigation software, financial analysis tools, and database systems that I had used throughout my banking career to build cases against sophisticated financial criminals. What Michael and Rebecca didn't understand, what they couldn't have imagined, was that their 3 years of financial exploitation had generated exactly the kind of digital evidence trail that professional fraud investigators use to build federal criminal cases. Every text message requesting emergency childcare had been sent through digital networks that preserved metadata about timing, location, and device information. Every Instagram post documenting their luxury activities while claiming financial hardship had been automatically archived with timestamps that could be correlated with their false statements to me. Every financial transaction they had made using money I had contributed had created digital records that could be analyzed for patterns of deception and misrepresentation. From a cybersecurity perspective, Michael and Rebecca had been conducting their fraud with the same level of operational security as amateur shoplifters. No awareness of what evidence they were creating, no understanding of how digital systems preserve information, and no consideration of how their actions could be analyzed by someone with professional investigative capabilities. Using the financial forensics software that Jennifer had given me access to, I began building what would become the most comprehensive fraud analysis of my career. The software allowed me to import 3 years of financial data from my bank accounts, credit card statements, and investment records, then cross-reference that information with digital evidence from Rebecca's social media activity, text message metadata, and calendar data to create a timeline that showed the relationship between their false claims and their actual activities. What emerged was a pattern of fraud so systematic and well-documented that it would have been suitable for use as a training case study in federal law enforcement fraud detection courses. Pattern analysis, financial misrepresentation. The software identified 47 instances over 3 years where Michael and Rebecca had made verifiable false statements about their financial situation in order to extract money or services from me. These statements ranged from claims about unexpected emergency expenses that were actually planned luxury purchases to assertions about childcare budget constraints during periods when they were spending money on premium recreational activities. Pattern analysis. Fraudulent emergency claims. The analysis identified 32 separate occasions where Michael and Rebecca had claimed emergency situations that required my immediate childcare assistance and subsequently posted social media content that proved their emergencies were actually planned recreational activities or luxury experiences. Pattern analysis. Systematic exploitation. The software calculated that over 3 years, Michael and Rebecca had extracted $361,900 in financial contributions and services from me, while providing approximately $2,400 in reciprocal value, holiday gifts, birthday gifts, and occasional dinner invitations. This represented a 99.3% extraction ratio that qualified as systematic exploitation under federal elder abuse guidelines. Pattern analysis. Escalating entitlement. The timeline analysis showed that their demands for financial assistance and childcare services had increased by 340% over 3 years, while their expressions of gratitude, reciprocal support, and consideration for my needs had decreased by 78%. This pattern indicated intentional conditioning designed to normalize increasing levels of exploitation. But perhaps most damaging was what the analysis revealed about the financial impact of their fraud on my retirement security. Financial impact. Analysis. Asset depletion. My contributions to Michael and Rebecca's household had reduced my liquid retirement savings by 62% and had required me to liquidate investments that were intended to provide long-term financial security. If their exploitation had continued at the current rate, I would have depleted my retirement assets within 7 years, forcing me to rely on Social Security income alone. Financial impact analysis. Opportunity cost. The money I had contributed to their household represented investment assets that would have generated approximately $18,000 in annual income throughout my retirement. By transferring those assets to Michael and Rebecca, I had reduced my annual retirement income by an amount that significantly impacted my long-term financial security. Financial impact analysis. Hidden costs. The analysis identified an additional $47,000 in hidden costs that I had absorbed as a result of their exploitation. Expenses like increased transportation costs, higher grocery bills from feeding their family, and emergency costs like my car breakdown that I had to handle alone because they were unavailable to provide assistance. The total financial impact of their 3-year fraud campaign was $408,900 in direct costs and lost investment income. This represented nearly half of my total retirement assets and qualified as aggravated elder financial abuse under both federal and Colorado state law. As I reviewed these results, I felt the same sense of professional satisfaction that I had experienced when building cases against major financial criminals. The evidence was comprehensive, the patterns were clear, and the case was strong enough to withstand any possible challenge or defense. But unlike my banking career cases, this analysis wasn't being prepared for prosecution by someone else. This case was being prepared for personal implementation by someone who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to use financial systems to implement consequences that fraudsters would never forget. That afternoon, I began developing what would become the most sophisticated financial response strategy of my career. Using the same strategic planning methodologies I had employed for complex banking fraud cases, I outlined a multi-phase approach that would address immediate protection, asset recovery, and long-term consequences. Phase 1. Asset protection. The first priority was preventing Michael and Rebecca from accessing or exploiting any additional financial resources. This required implementing security measures that would cut off their ability to continue their fraudulent activities while I prepared more comprehensive responses. I began by changing all of my banking access codes, updating my emergency contact information to remove Michael as an authorized representative, and implementing fraud alerts on all of my accounts that would require additional verification for any unusual transaction patterns. I also contacted my investment advisor to implement new security protocols that would prevent anyone except me from accessing information about my portfolio value, retirement income, or available assets. But the most important step was documenting my current financial position in detail so that any future claims Michael and Rebecca might make about my assets or income could be immediately refuted with comprehensive records. Phase 2. Evidence preservation. The second priority was ensuring that all evidence of their fraudulent activities was preserved in formats that would be admissible in legal proceedings and sufficient for professional fraud investigation standards. I created encrypted digital archives of all the social media evidence I had gathered, organized according to federal evidence management protocols that I had learned during my years of collaborating with law enforcement agencies. I prepared comprehensive financial analyses that documented every instance of false claims, fraudulent emergency assertions, and systematic exploitation, with supporting evidence and legal citations that would allow attorneys or investigators to understand the scope of their activities immediately. I also began creating detailed timeline documentation that correlated their false statements to me with their actual activities, using metadata analysis and digital forensics techniques that would be difficult for them to challenge or dispute. Phase 3. Professional consultation. The third priority was ensuring that my response strategy would be legally sound, professionally appropriate, and proportional to the scope of their fraud. I scheduled consultations with 3 different legal specialists to review my evidence and confirm that my planned responses were within legal boundaries and likely to be effective. I also contacted 2 banking security colleagues to review my technical approach and ensure that any system access or financial tools I planned to use were appropriate for my consultant status and properly authorized. Phase 4. Strategic implementation. The fourth priority was developing a response that would be immediate, comprehensive, and impossible for Michael and Rebecca to reverse or circumvent once it was initiated. This phase required the most careful planning, because I had only one opportunity to implement consequences that would be severe enough to stop their fraudulent behavior permanently, while being legally and professionally defensible. I needed to create a situation where Michael and Rebecca would understand immediately that they had made a catastrophic error in targeting me for financial exploitation, while ensuring that my response was proportional to their actions and focused on protecting my own interests rather than simply punishing them. But perhaps most importantly, I needed to make sure that my response would demonstrate to them exactly who they had been underestimating for 3 years, and exactly what capabilities they had been dismissing when they assumed I was just a harmless, elderly woman who could be manipulated indefinitely. Sunday morning, I began the technical preparations that would make Phase 4 implementation possible. Using cybersecurity protocols I had developed during my banking career, I created what amounted to a comprehensive financial investigation and response system focused specifically on Michael and Rebecca's fraud activities. The first step was establishing secure, encrypted communication channels with my professional network that would allow me to coordinate legal, financial, and technical responses without any possibility of Michael and Rebecca intercepting or anticipating my actions. The second step was gaining authorized access to financial monitoring systems that would allow me to track any attempts by Michael and Rebecca to access emergency funds, apply for credit using my information as a reference, or otherwise exploit our family relationship for financial advantage. The third step was preparing the technical infrastructure that would allow me to implement immediate financial consequences the moment I decided to move forward with my response strategy. This was the most delicate aspect of my preparation, because I needed to ensure that everything I was planning was legally authorized, professionally appropriate, and technically feasible without violating any laws or ethical guidelines that governed my security clearances and consultant status. But here's what Michael and Rebecca had never understood about my professional background. For 40 years, my job had been to protect financial institutions from exactly the kind of fraud they had been committing against me. I knew every technique. Fraudsters used to exploit trust relationships, every legal tool available for responding to financial crimes, and every technical capability that could be deployed to stop fraudulent activities and recover stolen assets. I also knew exactly how to use those tools defensively to protect my own interests when I was the victim of fraud. The technical preparation phase took me 18 hours of focused work, spread across Saturday evening and Sunday morning. When I was finished, I had created what amounted to a comprehensive fraud response system that could be activated with a single phone call and would implement multiple layers of financial consequences simultaneously. Michael and Rebecca's fraud activities had given me legal grounds to implement asset protection measures, recovery actions, and financial consequences that would cost them far more than everything they had stolen from me over 3 years. But, more importantly, my response would demonstrate to them exactly what they had been targeting when they decided to exploit my trust and affection. They had assumed they were stealing from a helpless elderly victim who would never have the knowledge or resources to fight back effectively. They were about to learn that they had actually been stealing from one of the most experienced financial crime investigators in Colorado, who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to make financial fraud as expensive and painful as possible for the people who committed it. Sunday evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the comprehensive fraud case I had built against Michael and Rebecca, the legal consultations that had confirmed my response strategy was appropriate and likely to be effective, and the technical preparations that would allow me to implement immediate financial consequences whenever I chose to act. My phone had 63 missed calls and 47 text messages from Michael and Rebecca, expressing increasing desperation about their childcare crisis and growing anger about my failure to respond to their demands. The messages had evolved, from panicked requests for help to entitled demands for my assistance to implied threats about limiting my access to Emma and Jake if I didn't immediately resolve their problems. "Mom, we've been trying to reach you for 2 days. We need you to pick up the kids and handle everything until we can get back. Rebecca is still sick and we can't travel. Margaret, please call us back immediately. We don't know what your problem is, but the kids need their grandmother right now. Mom, this is completely unacceptable. We're dealing with a real emergency here, and you're being selfish and irresponsible by not helping us. Margaret, if you don't call us back by tonight, we're going to have to make other arrangements for childcare, and that might affect how often we can include you in the kids' lives going forward." Reading these messages, I felt the same calm, focused determination that I had experienced during the most challenging fraud investigations of my career. Michael and Rebecca were revealing their true character under pressure, and they were making it very clear that they saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person whose feelings and needs mattered to them. They were still trying to manipulate me with threats and guilt, even after abandoning me in an emergency and lying to me for 4 days about their activities. They had learned nothing from this experience except that they needed to be more demanding and more threatening to maintain their exploitation system. That told me everything I needed to know about whether they were likely to change their behavior if I simply returned to my previous role as their unpaid childcare provider and emergency financial resource. They weren't going to change. They were going to escalate. Unless I implemented consequences that made continuing their fraud more expensive than stopping it. I had all the evidence I needed. I had all the legal authority I needed. I had all the technical capabilities I needed. And most importantly, I had all the professional motivation I needed to ensure that Michael and Rebecca learned exactly what happened when they targeted the wrong person for financial exploitation. The woman they had abandoned at a gas station was about to become the woman who would teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. And unlike their luxury resort vacation, this education was going to cost them everything they had stolen from me, plus interest, penalties, and processing fees that they were going to remember for the rest of their lives. Tomorrow morning, Margaret Chen, the exploited grandmother, was going to disappear forever. Margaret Chen, the banking security specialist, was about to take over, and Michael and Rebecca were about to discover that some mistakes are too expensive to survive. Monday morning at exactly 8 a.m., I sat in my home office with a cup of coffee and 40 years of professional expertise, ready to implement the most comprehensive fraud response of my career. The calm, focused clarity I felt was identical to what I had experienced during the most significant banking security cases of my professional life, except this time, I wasn't protecting a financial institution from criminals. I was protecting myself from family members who had spent 3 years systematically exploiting my love and trust. My phone had been ringing since 6:30 a.m. with increasingly frantic calls from Michael and Rebecca, who were apparently just discovering that their childcare exploitation system had completely collapsed while they were enjoying their luxury vacation. According to their social media posts, they were supposed to check out of the Broadmoor Resort that morning and drive back to deal with the emergency they had created by abandoning me. But I wasn't answering my phone. Margaret Chen, the accommodating grandmother who solved other people's problems, was done. Margaret Chen, the banking security specialist, was about to teach them exactly what happened when fraud victims had professional expertise and federal law enforcement connections. Began with a single phone call to Jennifer Martinez at First National Bank of Colorado. "Jen, it's Margaret. I'm ready to implement the fraud response we discussed. Can you confirm that all my security protocols are active and that the monitoring systems are in place?" "Everything's ready, Margaret. Your accounts are secured, the fraud detection algorithms are running, and we have automatic alerts set up for any unusual activity patterns. Are you sure you're ready to do this?" "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." Initiate the sequence. What happened next would be studied by banking security professionals for years as a masterclass in comprehensive fraud response implementation. At 8:15 a.m., I accessed the secure banking system that I had used throughout my career to investigate and respond to financial crimes. But this time, instead of protecting other people from fraud, I was implementing consequences against the people who had been defrauding me. The first step was executing what banking professionals call a complete asset protection sequence, ATASE, series of actions designed to immediately prevent fraudsters from accessing or exploiting any additional resources while comprehensive consequences are implemented. I began by canceling every financial connection between my accounts and Michael's household. The automatic transfers I had set up to help with their monthly expenses, transfers that totaled $2,800 per month and had been ongoing for 2 years, were immediately terminated. The emergency credit line I had established for them, which had a $25,000 limit and had been used 12 times over the past year for everything from car repairs to vacation expenses, was closed instantly with a demand for immediate repayment of the $1,800 outstanding balance. The joint investment account I had opened to save money for Emma and Jake's college educations, which contained $47,000 in contributions I had made over 3 years, was converted to an account accessible only by me, with a new beneficiary designation that excluded Michael and Rebecca entirely. But the most significant action was implementing what I called fraud recovery protocols on the money I had contributed to their house down payment. Here's what Michael and Rebecca had never understood about the $200,000 I had given them for their house. I hadn't given them a gift. I had made what banking law classified as a family loan, with specific terms and conditions that they had never bothered to read or understand. The loan documents, which they had signed without reading during the excitement of buying their house, included standard family loan provisions that protected my investment and allowed me to demand immediate repayment if the borrowers engaged in fraudulent activities or violated the trust conditions of the loan. Their systematic financial fraud, false emergency claims, and exploitation of my services constituted clear violations of the loan terms, which activated my legal right to demand immediate repayment of the full $200,000 plus 3 years of accumulated interest at the federal rate. At 8:47 a.m., Michael and Rebecca's mortgage company received official notification that the $200,000 they thought was a gift was actually a loan that was now in default due to borrower fraud, and that I was exercising my legal right to immediate repayment. Under Colorado law, this meant that Michael and Rebecca had 30 days to either pay me $218,000 in cash or face foreclosure proceedings on their house. But I wasn't finished. While Michael and Rebecca were discovering that their house was no longer secure, I was implementing the second phase of my response: professional and social consequences that would ensure they understood exactly what they had been stealing from and exactly who they had been underestimating. Using my connections in Colorado's banking and financial services industry, I began a coordinated information campaign that would make it very difficult for Michael to continue his career as a financial advisor, while having active fraud charges and investigations connected to his professional reputation. I sent comprehensive documentation of Michael's systematic financial fraud to the Colorado Division of Securities, which regulates financial advisors and has strict ethical requirements for professionals who manage other people's money. The evidence package included detailed analyses of his fraudulent claims, false emergency assertions, and systematic exploitation of a family member's trust. I also forwarded the same documentation to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, which maintains professional conduct records for all licensed financial advisors and can suspend or revoke licenses based on fraudulent activities, even when those activities occur outside of professional contexts. But perhaps most damaging was the report I filed with Michael's employer, the prestigious wealth management firm where he worked as a senior advisor. The firm had strict ethical conduct requirements for all employees, and evidence of systematic fraud and elder abuse created immediate liability concerns that would require investigation and potential termination. The documentation I provided was comprehensive enough that it would be impossible for Michael to claim the fraud accusations were misunderstandings or family disputes. The evidence showed clear patterns of criminal behavior that posed significant risks to any financial institution that employed him. Within 4 hours, Michael's professional reputation and career trajectory had been transformed from rising star in wealth management to financial advisor under investigation for elder abuse and systematic fraud. But Rebecca wasn't escaping consequences either. While Michael was dealing with career implosion, I was implementing carefully planned consequences for Rebecca's 3 years of social media exploitation and false representation, using digital forensics, capabilities I had developed during my banking career. I had created a comprehensive analysis of Rebecca's Instagram account that documented exactly how she had been monetizing content that relied on my unpaid labor and financial support. I prepared a detailed report showing that Rebecca had earned approximately $47,000 over 3 years through sponsored posts, affiliate marketing, and brand partnerships that promoted her as an authentic mother who created enriching experiences for her children through her own time, creativity, and resources. The report included side-by-side comparisons showing Rebecca's public posts about family activities versus the private evidence, text messages, receipts, and timeline analyses, proving that I had planned, funded, and supervised most of the activities she was taking credit for. But the most damaging element was documenting how Rebecca had been fraudulently representing her family's financial situation to her followers while soliciting sympathy and engagement through posts about budget-conscious parenting and making sacrifices for our children's future. Her followers had no idea that the woman sharing tips about affordable family fun had actually spent $3,000 on a luxury resort vacation while claiming to be too sick to care for her own children, or that the budget-friendly activities she posted about were primarily funded and coordinated by the grandmother who never appeared in any of the photos. At 2:30 p.m., I began sending this documentation to the companies that had sponsored Rebecca's content, along with detailed explanations of how their partnerships had been promoting fraudulent representation and exploitation of elder family members. I also sent copies to the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates social media advertising and requires influencers to disclose when content is sponsored or when they receive benefits from promoting products or experiences. But perhaps most effectively, I used my professional connections to ensure that Rebecca's fraudulent business model would be exposed to her followers in ways that would be impossible for her to deny or explain away. By 4 p.m. on Monday, Michael and Rebecca's entire life structure was collapsing around them, but they still had no idea what was causing the systematic destruction of everything they had built through 3 years of exploiting my trust and resources. They were dealing with mortgage default notices, professional investigations, social media account suspensions, and sponsor contract cancellations, but they hadn't yet connected these consequences to their treatment of me. That was about to change. At 4:30 p.m., as Michael and Rebecca were frantically trying to understand why their entire life was falling apart simultaneously, they received a comprehensive package delivered by certified mail to their Highlands Ranch home. The package contained 3 years of fraud analysis documentation, legal notification of loan default and foreclosure proceedings, copies of all the professional complaints and regulatory filings I had submitted, and a detailed explanation of exactly what had been happening to their accounts, careers, and social media business throughout the day. But most importantly, the package included a professional biography and career summary that would finally answer the question Michael had been too self-absorbed to ask in 35 years: exactly who his mother really was. Margaret Elizabeth Chen, Senior Vice President of Electronic Security Systems, retired. First National Bank of Colorado Professional Summary. 38 years of experience in banking security and cybercrime investigation. Led development of fraud prevention protocols protecting $2.3 billion in customer assets. Consultant to FBI Financial Crimes Division, 2001-2023. Expert witness in 47 federal cybercrime prosecutions. Top secret security clearance. Treasury Department, 1987-2023. Designer of electronic fraud detection systems used by 12 banking institutions across Colorado. Trainer for federal law enforcement cybercrime investigators. Author of Industry Standard Protocols for Elder Financial Abuse Investigation. Annual consulting income. 50,000 professional network. 200-plus cybersecurity specialists, federal agents, attorneys, and banking executives. Career highlights. Detected and prevented $47 million in attempted banking fraud, 2019-2023. Testified in U.S. Senate Subcommittee hearings on cybercrime prevention, 2018. Received Director's Award from FBI for contributions to financial crime investigation, 2020. Developed cybersecurity protocols adopted by Federal Reserve Banking Guidelines, 2017. Led investigation that resulted in largest elder fraud prosecution in Colorado history, 2016. Current status, retained consultant. First National Bank of Colorado active security clearances with 3 federal agencies. Volunteer instructor, FBI National Academy Cybercrime Courses Board member, Colorado Elder Rights Coalition. The woman you have been exploiting for 3 years is not a helpless elderly victim who can be manipulated indefinitely. She is one of the most experienced financial crime investigators in the state of Colorado, with professional capabilities and legal connections that you never bothered to discover. Today's consequences represent a comprehensive fraud response implementation designed to stop your criminal activities, recover stolen assets, and ensure that you understand exactly what you were stealing from and exactly who you were underestimating. This is what happens when you commit elder financial abuse against someone who has spent 40 years learning how to destroy people who exploit trust relationships for financial gain. At 6:47 p.m., my phone rang. It was Michael, and for the first time in 3 years, his voice carried the kind of genuine panic and respect that indicated he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. "Mom, please, we need to talk. I had no idea." "We didn't. Understand?" "Michael, you're going to listen to me very carefully, because this is the only conversation we're going to have about this situation." "Mom, please, can we just—" "You abandoned your mother at a gas station in the middle of nowhere because helping me would have inconvenienced your luxury vacation. You lied to me for 4 days about Rebecca's illness while posting social media content from a resort that cost more than most people's monthly salary. You have systematically exploited my love for my grandchildren to extract $361,900 in financial contributions and services over 3 years, while treating me like disposable help whose feelings and needs didn't matter. Mom, we're sorry. We didn't realize—" "Michael, you didn't realize because you never bothered to learn who I actually am or what I'm actually capable of. You assumed I was exactly what I appeared to be on the surface, a lonely elderly woman who needed your guidance and would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you were willing to provide. We know we made mistakes. Michael, you didn't make mistakes. You committed systematic fraud against a federal cybersecurity specialist with 40 years of experience in financial crime investigation. You exploited someone whose job was detecting and stopping exactly the kind of fraudulent behavior you've been conducting for 3 years." There was a long silence on Michael's end, and I could practically hear him processing the implications of what I was telling him. "Mom, what do you want from us? How do we fix this?" "Michael, you're going to pay back every penny you've stolen from me, plus interest and penalties, within 30 days. You're going to liquidate whatever assets you need to liquidate to come up with $387,000 in cash." "Mom, we don't have that kind of money. The house, the cars, everything we have is financed. We can't—" "Then you're going to sell the house I helped you buy, pay off your debts, and start over with whatever's left. You're going to learn to live within your actual means, instead of subsidizing your lifestyle through fraud and exploitation. But the kids, Emma and Jake, where will they live?" "Michael, you should have considered your children's housing stability before you decided to commit felony fraud against their grandmother. Your choices created this situation. Your choices are going to resolve it." "Mom, please, isn't there some way we can work this out? Some payment plan or arrangement that doesn't destroy our entire life?" "Michael, you destroyed your entire life when you decided that stealing from me was easier than living honestly. I'm just making the consequences visible." Over the following weeks, the complete scope of what I had implemented became clear to Michael and Rebecca, and to everyone else in their social and professional circles. Michael's career in financial services was over. The regulatory investigations, professional conduct violations, and fraud accusations made it impossible for him to maintain his securities licenses or find employment with any reputable financial institution. The wealth management firm that had employed him terminated his position immediately and launched their own internal investigation to ensure they weren't liable for any client relationships he had mismanaged. Rebecca's social media business collapsed entirely. The brand partnerships she had built over 3 years were terminated when companies learned that her content had been based on fraudulent representation and elder exploitation. Her Instagram account was suspended for terms of service violations related to undisclosed financial arrangements and false advertising. The followers who had admired her authentic motherhood content felt betrayed when they learned that her lifestyle had been subsidized through systematic abuse of her elderly mother-in-law. But perhaps most significantly, their social circle began to understand exactly what kind of people they had been supporting and admiring. The Highlands Ranch community where they lived was small enough that news of their fraud charges and house foreclosure spread quickly through social networks, school communities, and neighborhood groups. Other parents began questioning whether they wanted their children spending time with a family where the adults had been charged with elder abuse and financial exploitation. Emma and Jake's school became aware of the family's situation when Rebecca couldn't pay tuition fees and Michael's professional references were no longer valid for financial aid applications. The extended family, Rebecca's relatives and Michael's colleagues, began reassessing their relationships when they learned about the systematic exploitation and abandonment of an elderly family member. The social consequences of their fraud extended far beyond the financial and legal repercussions. They had revealed themselves to be people who were willing to exploit trust, lie systematically, and abandon family members when helping would be inconvenient. Those revelations had social costs that would follow them for years. 3 months after I implemented my fraud response, Michael and Rebecca had sold their house, paid back the money they owed me, and moved into a small rental house in a different part of Denver. Michael found work as a junior financial analyst at a company that didn't require securities licenses, earning about half of what he had made in his previous position. Rebecca attempted to restart her social media career under a different name, but with limited success since her content no longer had the financial support that had made her previous lifestyle appear attainable. Most importantly, they were finally living within their actual means instead of subsidizing their lifestyle through exploitation of family members. Emma and Jake adjusted to their new circumstances better than their parents did, partially because they were young enough to adapt to change, but mostly because they were finally living in a household where the adults were taking responsibility for their own choices instead of blaming other people for their problems. My relationship with my grandchildren was eventually restored, but under very different terms than had existed previously. Michael and Rebecca no longer had the leverage to use my access to Emma and Jake as a tool for extracting unpaid services, because they understood that any attempt to manipulate our relationship would result in immediate professional consequences that they couldn't afford to survive. When Emma asked me why they had to move out of their big house, I told her the truth in age-appropriate terms. Sometimes, adults make choices that have expensive consequences, and when that happens, they have to take responsibility for fixing the problems they created. When Jake asked me why Mommy and Daddy seemed sad all the time, I explained, growing up is hard, even for adults. Sometimes people have to learn difficult lessons about how to treat other people with respect and kindness. 6 months after my fraud response implementation, I received a call from David Park at the FBI asking whether I would be willing to speak at a federal law enforcement conference about elder financial abuse and fraud response strategies. Margaret, your case has become the gold standard for how elder abuse victims can protect themselves when they have professional expertise and resources. We want to use it as a training example for agents who work financial crimes cases. David, I'd be happy to share what I learned, but I want to make sure the focus is on prevention and early intervention, not just consequences after fraud has already occurred. That's exactly what we want to emphasize. Your case shows that elder abuse is often much more sophisticated than people realize, and that victims with professional backgrounds can be targeted specifically because fraudsters assume that family relationships will prevent them from using their expertise defensively. The presentation I developed for federal law enforcement became part of standard training curricula for agents who investigate financial crimes against elderly victims. My case study was used to teach investigators about recognizing systematic exploitation, building comprehensive fraud cases, and implementing consequences that were proportional to the scope of criminal activities. But perhaps more importantly, my experience became part of elder rights advocacy efforts that helped other victims understand that they had options for responding to financial exploitation, even when the perpetrators were family members. The most significant outcome of this experience wasn't the financial recovery or the professional recognition. It was the personal transformation that came from finally understanding and asserting my own value and capabilities. For 3 years, I had accepted treatment that diminished my worth and minimized my contributions, because I wanted to maintain family relationships and avoid conflict. I had allowed myself to be positioned as someone whose needs were less important than other people's convenience, whose feelings were less valid than other people's preferences, and whose expertise was less valuable than other people's assumptions. The process of building a fraud case against Michael and Rebecca forced me to analyze my own behavior patterns and recognize how I had enabled their exploitation by consistently prioritizing their comfort over my own dignity. I learned that protecting relationships that require you to accept abuse isn't actually protecting anything worth preserving. I learned that people who love you don't systematically exploit your generosity while taking your contributions for granted. I learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary for maintaining relationships that are healthy and reciprocal. Most importantly, I learned that my 40 years of professional expertise hadn't become irrelevant when I retired. My skills, knowledge, and capabilities were still valuable, and I had every right to use them to protect myself when other people chose to exploit my trust. Today, 3 years after my fraud response implementation, my life looks very different than it did when I was functioning as Michael and Rebecca's unpaid childcare provider and emergency financial resource. I've returned to active consulting work with First National Bank of Colorado, taking on complex fraud investigations that utilize my expertise in elder financial abuse patterns. My annual consulting income has increased to $75,000. And I'm working on cases that I find professionally stimulating and personally meaningful. I've also become involved in elder rights advocacy, serving on the board of Colorado Elder Rights Coalition, and providing training for other elder abuse victims who want to understand their options for legal and financial response. My relationship with Emma and Jake has evolved into something much healthier than the exploitation-based dynamic that existed previously. We spend time together because we enjoy each other's company, not because their parents need free childcare. I'm able to be the grandmother I want to be, someone who provides love, wisdom, and special experiences, without being taken for granted or treated like hired help. My relationship with Michael is slowly rebuilding, but on very different terms than existed before. He's learning to see me as a person whose feelings and needs matter, rather than as a resource to be utilized when convenient. He's also learning to take responsibility for his own choices and their consequences, rather than expecting other people to solve problems he creates. Rebecca and I maintain polite but distant contact for the sake of family harmony. She understands that any attempt to return to the previous exploitation patterns would result in immediate consequences that she can't afford to risk. Our interactions are cordial but limited, which suits both of us perfectly. But perhaps most importantly, I've reclaimed my sense of personal worth and professional identity. I'm no longer Margaret Chen, the lonely widow who needs guidance and management from younger family members. I'm Margaret Chen, the experienced professional who has valuable contributions to make and deserves to be treated with respect and appreciation. The story of how my son's family left me on the side of the road and I emptied their bank account isn't really a story about revenge or punishment. It's a story about what happens when people underestimate someone whose love they've been taking for granted. Michael and Rebecca spent 3 years assuming that I would accept whatever treatment they chose to give me because I was desperate to maintain access to my grandchildren and terrified of being excluded from their lives. They assumed that my age and retirement status meant that I was powerless to respond to their exploitation in any meaningful way. They were wrong about everything. They were wrong about my professional capabilities, my financial resources, my legal options, and my willingness to implement consequences when people chose to abuse my trust and generosity. But most importantly, they were wrong about what my love actually meant. They thought my love meant that I would accept any treatment, overlook any behavior, and continue providing support regardless of how they chose to treat me. They thought unconditional love meant unconditional tolerance for exploitation and abuse. Real love means caring enough about people to stop enabling their destructive behavior, even when stopping that behavior is expensive and painful for everyone involved. Real love means refusing to subsidize choices that hurt other people, even when those people are family members you care about deeply. Real love means setting boundaries that protect your own well-being and dignity, even when other people prefer the version of you that accepts whatever they choose to give. The hardest lesson I learned from this experience is that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. Michael and Rebecca needed to learn that actions have consequences, that trust has value, and that other people's feelings and needs matter as much as their own convenience and preferences. They needed to learn those lessons more than they needed my continued financial support and unpaid services. And I needed to learn that my value as a person wasn't dependent on other people's willingness to appreciate my contributions or treat me with respect. My value was inherent in who I am and what I'm capable of, regardless of whether other people recognized or acknowledged that value. The woman they left at that gas station wasn't someone who needed their permission to be valuable. She was someone who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to protect herself and others from people who exploited trust for personal gain. And when she finally decided to stop protecting them from themselves, they learned exactly what they had been underestimating for 3 years. Today, when people ask me how I found the strength to implement such comprehensive consequences against my own family members, I tell them that it wasn't strength, it was professional competence applied to personal protection. And when they ask me whether I regret how severely I responded to their behavior, I tell them that my only regret is waiting 3 years to stop accepting treatment that was beneath my dignity and inconsistent with my value. The woman who was abandoned on the side of the road taught the people who abandoned her exactly what they lost when they chose convenience over character, and that lesson changed everything for all of us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.